in an invisible web of intention and will. But some things do not belong to that web at all. Things older than the Republic, older than the Sith, born of a magic that answers to no Jedi Council and bows to no dark side. Something was coming. Something that did not arrive on a hyperspace lane, that left no transponder signal, that simply tore its way into being where nothing had been a moment before. The rift opened above a nameless moon on the fringes of imperial space, a scar of violet light hanging in the sky like a wound that refused to close. For 3 heartbeats it pulsed, widening, and then it spat out a man, mid-swing, sword raised, mouth still shaping a word of banishment that would never finish, and slammed him into the permacrete roof of an abandoned listening post hard enough to crack the duracrete beneath him. Geralt of Rivia lay still for a long moment, listening to a sky that sounded wrong. No crows, no wind through pine needles, no distant howl of something with too many teeth, just a low mechanical hum, and somewhere beyond it, the whine of engines that didn't belong to any airship he'd ever hunted beneath. He opened his eyes, cat-slitted, gold as a coin freshly minted, and found stars where there should have been the familiar bruised dusk of the continent sky, and 2 moons where there should have been 1. Well, he thought, pushing himself up on one elbow, that's new. His medallion, a wolf's head, cast in old silver, worn smooth by decades against his chest, was buzzing. Not the low warning thrum he knew from proximity to magic gone wrong, but something sharper, more erratic, like a nerve struck wrong. He closed a gloved hand around it and felt heat bleed through the leather. The listening post beneath him groaned, settling. He was on a rooftop, he realized, some squat gray installation bristling with antennae and dish-shaped sensors. Half of it scorched black, as though something had already tried and failed to burn it down. Smoke curled from a ruptured vent nearby. Whatever this place was, someone had already had a very bad day here, and Geralt had landed in the wreckage of it. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, joints protesting only slightly. The mutations that had made him faster and stronger than any ordinary man had also spared him the worst of the fall, though he'd feel the bruising along his ribs by nightfall, wherever nightfall happened to fall in a sky with 2 moons. His silver sword was still in his hand, and steel rode at his hip where it always did. Small mercies. Whatever had thrown him here, it hadn't stripped him bare. He tested his senses the way he'd been trained to since before he could properly remember training. A slow inhale through the nose, cataloging. Ozone, burnt insulation, the metallic tang of blood, old and dried, somewhere below. And underneath all of it, so faint he might have imagined it, something that reminded him of chaos, of the ley line hum he could feel in ancient elven ruins back home, except wrong, somehow, structured differently. Like a song played in a key his ear wasn't built for. A shout below snapped his attention down. He moved to the roof's edge, silent as instinct, and looked down into a Durasteel courtyard where 4 figures in stark white armor swept their weapons across the wreckage in tight, practiced formation. Their armor gleamed like polished bone, faceless behind black-visored helmets, and the weapons in their hands hummed with a light that was neither flame nor lightning, but something manufactured to imitate both. Geralt had hunted things that wore armor like that in dreams once, golems, maybe, or something summoned rather than born. But these moved like men, trained men, soldiers. Said the reading spiked right here. One of them was saying, voice flattened by a vocoder. Something came through, not a ship. Could be another experiment breach, said another. Command said to shoot first if it's not wearing a uniform. Geralt's jaw tightened. He had heard those words in 100 different tongues across 100 different battlefields, and they never led anywhere good. He weighed his options the way he always did, quickly, coldly, without sentiment. 4 of them, armored, armed with something he didn't recognize, and therefore couldn't properly guess the danger of. He was a stranger dropped into the middle of someone else's war, before he'd even had the chance to learn its name. He decided, as he decided most things, he would not be the one to start it. He backed away from the ledge, intending to find another way down, another way out, and his boot came down on a loose panel of scorched metal. It shrieked against the roof like a wounded animal. 4 helmets snapped upward in unison. There. Movement upper level. This is Imperial property. Identify yourself or be fired upon. Geralt didn't understand half the words, but he understood the tone. He'd heard that in every language too. He raised open hands, steel and silver both still gripped, but low, non-threatening, the universal shape of "I am not your enemy," and called down in a voice roughened by centuries of use, pitched to carry without shouting. "I don't know what property this is. I don't know what fired upon means where you're from. I'd rather not find out." A beam of red light answered him instead of words, searing past his shoulder close enough to singe the leather of his jacket and blast a smoking crater into the roofing behind him. Geralt's body reacted before his mind finished processing the insult of it. 2 decades, no longer, far longer than that. Time enough that he'd stopped counting some seasons ago, of a Witcher's training took over, and he was already moving, already rolling low across the roof as a second bolt scorched the space he'd occupied a heartbeat before. Not diplomats, then, he thought, and something in him, old, tired, and utterly unsurprised, settled into the familiar shape of violence. He came up at the roof's edge and dropped, using a length of twisted conduit as a handhold to slow his fall, landing in a crouch in the courtyard's shadow before the troopers had fully tracked his descent. His silver blade, trained for beasts that bled black ichor and worse, cut instead through white plastoid as he closed the distance, not because the metal deserved silver's edge, but because steel was still sheathed and there hadn't been time to switch. The trooper nearest him got off one wild shot before Geralt's blade found the gap at the shoulder joint, and the man folded with a strangled cry that sounded far too human, far too mortal, to be some monster wearing armor as disguise. Geralt's stomach turned, just slightly. A man, just a man, in a shell like a beetle's, screaming like any other man screams. The remaining 3 opened fire in earnest now, and Geralt threw himself sideways, feeling the burn of a grazing shot along his forearm. Hot, sharp, unlike any wound a blade or claw had ever given him. He rolled behind an overturned supply crate, breath coming hard, and reached, instinctively, desperately, for the only thing he had left that might even the odds. Ard. He thrust his palm forward and pushed, the way he'd pushed 1,000 times before to send a drowner sprawling or knock a strigo off its feet, and the sign answered, but strangely, like a muscle cramping mid-stride. A wave of invisible force roared out of his palm, catching 2 of the troopers and hurling them backward into the courtyard wall hard enough to crack their helmets. But the effort of it cost him more than it should have, a hollow ache spreading through his chest, as though he'd drawn on some well that ran shallower here than it did at home. He staggered, one hand braced against the crate, and understood with sudden clarity. Whatever magic lived in this world, it was not his magic. Not quite. Close enough to answer his call. Not close enough to answer it cheaply. The 4th trooper, the one still standing, leveled his weapon with a shaking hand. Don't move." Geralt met the black visor with a stare he'd given 100 men in 100 taverns who'd made the mistake of drawing steel on a witcher for coin or sport or fear. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said, low and even, steel returning to his other hand, though he did not raise it. "But I'll finish one you start." For a moment neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere behind the trooper, a new voice cut through the calm static, cold, precise, carrying an authority that made even the armored man's shoulders straighten reflexively. "Stand down. All of you. This one is not to be killed." Geralt's eyes narrowed. Someone, something, had been watching. And whatever it was, it had just decided he was worth keeping alive. He did not find that reassuring in the slightest. New world, he thought, wiping blood from a shallow cut along his jaw with the back of his glove. Silver still humming faintly in his grip. New monsters. Same old story. He had a feeling. The kind honed by decades of contracts gone sideways and villagers who lied about the terms. That this was only the beginning. If you want to see more characters, enter the Star Wars galaxy. Hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The voice on the comm did not belong to any of the 4 troopers in the courtyard, and its authority carried a weight that made even armored men flinch. Geralt watched the standing trooper's rifle waver, torn between the order to fire and the order to stand down, and used the hesitation the only way he knew how, by not giving it a reason to resolve in violence. "You heard him," Geralt said, sheathing steel. Not Silver, not yet. Silver stayed close at hand around anything he didn't understand, and raising his empty palm again. Whoever he is, on your knees, hands where I can see them. The trooper's voice cracked with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. Geralt had unmade 2 of his squad in under a minute with a blade and 1 shove of something the man's scanners couldn't have registered as anything but impossible. That kind of thing put a tremor in even a disciplined voice. Geralt did not kneel. He had knelt for kings and for children and for the dying, but not for strangers with weapons pointed at his chest in a world he'd been in for less than an hour. He crouched instead, low, blade hand loose, a posture that could become stillness or violence, with equal ease depending on what the next few seconds offered him. Boots on Duracrete announced the newcomers before he saw them, a squad of 6, better armored than the first 4, their plate a deeper gray, patterns etched into pauldrons like rank insignia Geralt couldn't read, but recognized the shape of authority in nonetheless. At their center walked a woman in an officer's long coat, dark hair scraped back, a data slate in one gloved hand, and an expression that suggested she found the whole scene faintly tedious rather than alarming. "Report," she said, not looking up from a slate. "Ma'am, the individual took out Reeves and Corso. Some kind of energy discharge, non-standard. No weapon signature we recognize." Her eyes lifted then, finding Geralt across the courtyard, and something in her gaze sharpened, not fear, but calculation, the look of someone doing sums in her head and not liking the answer. Sensors picked up a dimensional flux 20 minutes ago. Spatial tear localized, gone as fast as it opened. She studied him the way a man might study a wolf that had wandered out of a tree lean into a market square. Dangerous, yes, but also interesting. "You didn't come out of a ship." "No," Gerald agreed. "Where then?" "Somewhere else." He saw no profit in elaborating, and less in lying to someone who clearly already suspected the truth. "I don't know this place. I don't know your war, if you've got one. I didn't come here to fight it." Everyone's fighting a war, whether they know it or not. The officer's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "You're strong enough to put down 2 of my men barehanded and fast enough to dodge blaster fire at close range. That makes you Imperial property until Lord Vander says otherwise. Sensors flagged your arrival to the Inquisitorius the moment the tier opened. He's already inbound." Inquisitorius. The word meant nothing to Geralt, but the way she said it, the faint stiffening of the troopers around her, the way even the officer's confidence thinned at the edges when she spoke it, told him everything he needed to know. Some names carried their own weather with them. He'd learned to read that weather long before he'd learned most men's names at all. "I don't answer to lords," he said. "Not since I stopped being paid to. You'll find that's not really a choice you get to make here." Geralt's grip on Silver tightened, just slightly, an old and familiar readiness settling into his shoulders. He'd been offered gilded cages before, by kings who wanted a tame monster for their court, by mages who wanted a leashed blade for their ambitions. He had said no to all of them, sooner or later, and it had cost him nearly every time. He was prepared to pay that cost again. But before the officer could give whatever order was forming behind her eyes, his medallion screamed. Not the low hum from the rooftop. A full, shuddering pulse of heat against his chest, sharp enough to make him gasp, sharp enough to draw every eye in the courtyard toward him as he staggered half a step, hand flying to the silver wolf's head as though he could physically hold the sensation at bay. Magic, his instinct said, older than language, older than the path itself. Asterisk close. Powerful. Buried, asterisk. "What's it doing?" one trooper asked, weapon half-raising again. "I don't know," Geralt said honestly, breath tight. The medallion had reacted like this exactly twice before in his long life, once above a portal that led somewhere no living thing should walk, and once atop an elven ruin so soaked in old chaos that even ordinary men could feel their hair stand on end within 100 paces of it. Whatever was buried beneath this listening post, it was not nothing. It called to something in him the way ley lines called to mages, the way moonlight called to werewolves. The officer's data slate chimed. She glanced down at it, and whatever she read made her lips press into a thin line. "Sublevel 3, she murmured, almost to herself. "There's a sealed chamber down there. Pre-Imperial. We flagged it for inquisitorious retrieval months ago, and never got clearance to breach it." Her eyes came back up to Geralt, calculating anew. "Your reaction might be relevant to that." "I don't care what's relevant to your empire," Geralt said. "I care about getting my bearings and getting on." "That's not on the table." She turned to her men. "Take him. Non-lethal restraints. Lord Vandher will want him conscious when he—" She never finished the order. The ground beneath the courtyard shuddered, not an explosion, not quite, but a deep subterranean groan, like something enormous shifting in its sleep, and dust sifted down from cracks that spiderwebbed across the permacrete in an instant. Geralt's medallion screamed again, and this time he felt it too, a pressure in the air, a presence, rising from below like heat off summerstone. "Sublevel 3's breaching itself," a trooper said, voice climbing toward panic. "Whatever's down there is." The floor of the courtyard split. Geralt did not wait to see what climbed out of it. Whatever slept beneath this installation, whatever ancient thing his medallion recognized as kin to the chaos of his own world, its waking was not his fight. Not yet, not until he understood the shape of the ground he stood on. And amid chaos, amid confusion, amid soldiers scrambling to reform a perimeter around a threat none of them understood, a Witcher's oldest and most reliable skill reasserted itself. He ran. Not blindly. Geralt never ran blindly, even from the worst horrors of the continent, but with purpose, angling away from the widening crack in the courtyard floor and toward the tree line, or what passed for a tree line here, a ridge of dark rock and low, alien scrub that offered at least the promise of cover. Blaster fire chased him, wild and unfocused, more concerned now with whatever was emerging from below than with the stranger fleeing the scene. He heard the officers shouting orders, heard something enormous scrape against duracrete, heard a sound like grinding stone that reminded him, absurdly, achingly, of home, of caves beneath elven ruins where things older than kingdoms stirred when disturbed. He did not look back until the ridge swallowed him from view, chest heaving, the graze along his forearm burning where sweat found the wound. Below in the valley, smoke rose from the listening post in earnest now, backlit by flashes of red blaster light and something else, a deep violet glow, the same color as the rift that had brought him here, pulsing up from the earth like a second, wounded sun. Sealed chamber, the officer had said. Pre-imperial. Geralt pressed a hand to his medallion, feeling it settle by slow degrees back into its familiar quiet hum, and understood with the particular dread of a man who had learned never to trust coincidence. Whatever slept beneath that base was not native to this galaxy any more than he was. Something else had fallen through a tier like his, once, long enough ago that men had built walls and secrecy around its resting place. Something his own blood recognized, however dimly, as kin. He did not know yet if that made an ally or the very first monster this world would ask him to kill. Behind him, sirens began to wail across the valley. New voices, new units, the machinery of an empire mobilizing in force. Ahead of him, the alien wilderness stretched into darkness beneath two indifferent moons. Geralt exhaled once, slow, and started walking. Whatever chapter this galaxy wanted to write him into, he intended to choose his own first line. The wilderness beyond the ridge was not wilderness at all, not really. Geralt realized this within the first quarter-hour walking. Boots crunching over ground scarred by old landing pads and half-buried conduit lines swallowed by dust and the alien scrub that passed for vegetation here. This world had been touched by hands before, industrial hands, and abandoned. Whatever purpose the listening post had served, it had not been alone out here. He kept the glow of the base at his back, moving by the light of two moons that cast doubled shadows across the rocky ground, and let his senses do the work his eyes could not. Cat-slitted pupils drank in what little light there was. Ears attuned across decades to the difference between wind and warning caught the distant thrum of engines lifting off. Reinforcements, probably more of the armored men with their beetle shell suits and manufactured lightning. He did not want to be found by them again so soon. The medallion had gone quiet, but not still. It hummed now at a low, steady pitch, the way it did near ordinary elven ruins. Old magic, settled magic. Magic that had made its peace with being buried rather than fighting to stay awake. Whatever had cracked open the courtyard floor behind him had either been subdued or had gone still again on its own. Neither possibility comforted him. He found the cache by accident, or by the kind of accident that a lifetime on the path had taught him not to entirely trust as accident at all. The ground here dipped into a shallow basin, and at its center, half swallowed by drifted grit and the roots of stunted alien trees, stood the ruin of something that had once been deliberately built and deliberately hidden. Not imperial. The architecture was wrong for that. Older, more organic, curved stone worked in patterns that reminded him, distantly, of elven craftsmanship, though the resemblance was more a matter of feeling than of form. A doorway, or what had been one, stood half-collapsed at the basin's heart, and from within it drifted the faint, unmistakable hum of something Geralt's medallion recognized instantly. He approached with silver already loose in its scabbard, alchemy instinct screaming the old familiar warning. Unknown ruin, unknown age. Proceed as though everything wants to kill you, because more often than not, something does. The interior, what remained of it, was a single chamber no larger than a modest hall, its walls etched with symbols that meant nothing to him, and yet felt oddly legible. The way a language he'd never learned might still carry recognizable shapes of grief or warning. At the chamber's center, resting in a cradle of stone untouched by the collapse around it, sat a small pyramidal object, its surface faintly luminous, veined with light the color of a dying ember. His medallion screamed. Geralt staggered back a step, hand flying to the silver wolf at his throat, and for a moment the world tilted, not with vertigo, but with the particular disorientation of standing too close to something that remembered being powerful even in its diminishment. He had felt this before, once, in the ruins beneath Kaer Morhen's oldest foundations, where old Ain side magic had been sealed away by hands that no longer existed to explain why. "What are you?" he murmured, not really expecting an answer, and got one anyway. The pyramid pulsed, and light spilled from it, not violently, not like the rift that had thrown him here, but slow and deliberate, resolving into shapes that hovered in the air above the stone cradle. Geralt's breath caught. He had seen illusions before, magecraft, glamours, the tricks of Doppler and succubi. But this was different, cleaner, a memory given form rather than a lie given shape. Figures in flowing robes moved through the projected light, carrying weapons that hummed and glowed like blades forged from captured starlight rather than steel. They fought something Geralt couldn't quite make out, a shifting darkness, formless, hungry, and lost, by the look of it, one by one, until the light guttered and only a single robed figure remained, kneeling before the pyramid, pressing something into the stone cradle with the particular tenderness of a man burying a friend rather than an object. A relic, Geralt thought. A grave marker. The projection faded. The chamber fell silent, but for the low hum of the pyramid and the distant, muffled thunder of engines somewhere above the basin's rim. He should have left it alone. Every instinct that had kept him alive across decades of contracts told him that whatever this was, it belonged to a grief older than his understanding of this world, and disturbing graves rarely ended well for the ones doing the disturbing. But his medallion's reaction told him something else, something that mattered more in this moment than caution. Whatever chaos, whatever force, if that was the word these people used for it, animated this pyramid, it was kin to the magic in his own blood. Not identical, but close enough that his body recognized it the way a wolf recognizes another wolf's howl across unfamiliar country. He reached out slowly and let two fingers brush the pyramid surface. The reaction was immediate and violent. Light flooded the chamber, and Geralt felt something surge up through his arm, not painful, exactly, but enormous, a pressure like standing too near a waterfall, all that force compressed into a single point of contact. Visions battered against the inside of his skull, too fast to parse. A temple of white stone beneath twin suns. A council of robed figures arguing in hushed, urgent tones. A boy no older than 10 holding a glowing blade with trembling hands. And beneath it all, a single overwhelming impression. Balance broken. The war does not end. It only sleeps. He tore his hand away with a gasp, staggering back against the chamber wall, chest heaving as though he'd run a mile uphill. The pyramid's light dimmed to its low ember glow once more, inert, patient, as it had been before he touched it. Sanctuary, he muttered, tasting the strange word on his tongue, though he couldn't have said where it came from, whether the vision had planted it there, or whether it was simply the nearest word his own mind could offer for what he'd felt. Some places were built to hold what could not be destroyed. He knew that shape of purpose intimately. He had spent half his life hunting things men had tried and failed to bury properly. Outside, the drone of engines grew louder, and Geralt's instincts sharpened back into more immediate focus. Whatever this pyramid was, whatever war it mourned, it would have to wait. The Empire's soldiers were searching in earnest now, and searchlights swept the basin's rim in slow, sweeping arcs that would find this ruin within minutes if he didn't move. He looked once more at the pyramid, feeling an unfamiliar reluctance to leave it, the same reluctance he'd felt centuries ago now, walking away from graves he dug with his own hands. Not my grief to guard, he told himself, and meant it mostly, but he memorized the shape of the basin, the angle of the ridge, the particular scent of alien scrub burned faintly by proximity to old magic, the way he memorized every place worth remembering on the path. If this world had more of these buried griefs scattered across it, he suspected he had not seen the last of them. He slipped from the chamber as the first searchlight crested the ridge, moving low and fast along the basin's shadowed edge, silver blade catching only starlight as he ran. Behind him, the pyramid's ember glow faded back into stillness, patient as stone, waiting, as such things always waited, for someone else to disturb its rest. Ahead, somewhere in the dark, a war was already being fought that he hadn't chosen and didn't yet understand. He'd learned long ago that ignorance of a conflict's rules was no protection from its consequences. Best to keep moving. Best to find solid ground, a village, a settlement, some familiar shape of desperate people willing to pay for a problem solved, before this galaxy decided for him which side of its war he'd be standing on. The searchlights swept past without finding him. Somewhere behind, the Empire's soldiers shouted to one another in the dark, chasing a trail already gone cold. Geralt of Rivia walked on beneath two moons, medallion quiet against his chest, and did not look back. 3 days of walking brought Geralt to the edge of civilization, or what passed for civilization on a world this far from the Empire's polished core. He crested a final ridge, as the system's pale sun broke over the horizon, and looked down on a settlement of squat permacrete buildings and canvas roof stalls clustered around a cluster of moisture vaporators, their skeletal frames rising from the dust like the ribs of some long-dead beast. Smoke curled from cook fires. Children's voices carried faintly on the wind. It was, in every way that mattered to a man who had spent a lifetime reading the shape of desperate places, a village like any other he had walked into 100 times before. He'd shed the worst of his strangeness before approaching, cleaned the blood from his jaw, bound the graze on his forearm with a strip of cloth, wrapped his medallion beneath his shirt so its faint silver glint wouldn't draw a second glance. He still looked like exactly what he was, a stranger, armed, road-worn, with eyes that didn't match any face a farming settlement was likely to have seen before. But strangers with steel at their hip were not so uncommon in places law reached only rarely. He'd gathered from what little he'd overheard on his walk, traders' bands, moisture farmers muttering to each other about raiders and worse, all of it carried in a language that, absurdly, his ear had begun to parse within a day, some old witcher instinct for tongues doing quiet work beneath his conscious notice. The settlement's edge held a trading post, its awning patched with mismatched fabric, and behind its counter stood a woman old enough that her hands shook faintly even as she counted coin. No, not coin, he corrected himself, watching a transaction ahead of him. Small metal chips, credits, passed hand to hand with the same wary calculation coin had always inspired. "You're not from a settlement," the old woman said when his turn came, studying him with the particular sharpness of someone who had survived a long time by reading strangers correctly and quickly. "Not Imperial either." "What are you selling?" "Nothing," Geralt said. "Looking for work. I hunt things that need hunting." Something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the specific hope of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of stranger to walk out of the wastes. "Hunt things," she repeated slowly. "What kind of things?" "Whatever's paying." She glanced past him toward the settlement's edge, where a knot of figures had gathered near a battered speeder, arguing in low, urgent tones. Go talk to Band Ray, out past the South Vaporator Field. Lost 2 hands and half a herd in the last 2 weeks to something out in the flats. Nobody local will go near the place anymore." Her voice dropped. "Imperial patrols don't bother with settlements this small. We're on our own out here." On our own out here. Gerald had heard that sentence, in one form or another, in every backwater village on the continent that had ever hired him. It was the oldest sentence in his trade. He found Ray, a broad-shouldered man with sun-cracked skin and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake arguing with fate for several nights running, pacing outside a modest homestead at the settlement's southern edge. A scattering of neighbors gathered around him in various states of fear and frustration. "Another one gone last night," Ray was saying as Gerald approached, close enough to catch the words. "Didn't even hear it. Karst went out to check the fence line and just didn't come back. Found blood. No body. Could be raiders," someone offered, without much conviction. "Raiders don't leave prints like that." Ray's jaw tightened. "Long as my forearm. Too many toes. I've farmed this land 20 years. I know every beast that walks these flats, and I've never seen tracks like that." Gerald cleared his throat, and every eye in the small crowd turned toward him with a particular wariness reserved for armed strangers appearing uninvited at private grief. "I hunt beasts," he said simply. "I heard you've got one worth hunting." Ray studied him for a long moment, measuring, the way men who'd lost people learned to measure quickly, weighing desperation against risk. "You don't look like Imperial military. Don't look like a bounty hunter neither, not dressed like that." "I'm not either of those things." "What are you then?" Gerald had answered that question 1,000 times, in 1,000 different tongues, to 1,000 different frightened faces, and the answer never really changed no matter how the words shifted to fit the listener. "Someone who kills what needs killing, for coin, because that's the trade I know." It wasn't the whole truth. It rarely was, with strangers. But it was true enough to matter, and Ray seemed to hear the truth in it regardless of the words around it, the particular flatness of a man who had done this work too many times to romanticize it. 50 credits, Ray said. "That's what I've got to offer. Whatever's out there, if you kill it and bring back proof, 50 credits and a hot meal and a bed for as long as you need one." Gerald considered the offer with the same careful weighing he gave every contract, not the coin itself, which mattered little to a man who'd learned to survive on far less, but the shape of the job, the honesty of the man offering it. Ray's eyes held none of the calculation Gerald had learned to distrust in noblemen and merchants who wanted a problem solved quietly and cheaply and were prepared to lie about the danger to get it. This was a man frightened for his neighbors, offering what little he had. "Tell me everything you know about the tracks," Gerald said, "and show me where the blood was found." Ray's shoulders loosened, some of the tension bleeding out of him at the simple fact of having been heard. "You'll take the job, then?" "I'll look at what's out there," Gerald said. "Then I'll decide what needs killing." It was, he reflected as Ray led him toward the fence line where his neighbor had vanished, the most honest thing he'd said since falling into this galaxy. He did not know yet whether the thing stalking these moisture farms was beast or something else entirely. This world had already shown him that the line between monster and man wore stranger disguises here than it ever had on the continent, armored soldiers and buried relics, and magic that answered to two sides at war with each other. But a job was a job, and a village afraid of its own fence line was a village he understood, whatever galaxy it belonged to. The tracks, when he found them, made his medallion hum low and steady against his chest, not the violent alarm of the buried pyramid, but a different note entirely, one he recognized from a lifetime spent reading the language of things that hunted in the dark. Whatever walked these flats at night, it left prints too deliberate for a mere animal, spaced with the calculated patience of something that stalked rather than simply hunted for food. He crouched at the fence line, studying the smear of dried blood against pale dust, and felt the old familiar focus settle over him. The narrowing of the world down to a single problem, a single trail, a single truth waiting to be found and named and, if necessary, killed. "Something's out there," he said quietly, half to Ray, half to himself. "Something that knows exactly what it's doing." Behind him, the twin suns climbed higher over the Vaporator Field, and somewhere beyond the flats, something waited in the dark for nightfall, Patient as only a true predator could be patient. Patient the way something wearing a mask over its own dark hunger might wait, though Geralt would not learn the truth of what stalked these fields until the following night, when the mask finally came off. Night fell fast on the flats, the twin suns dropping below the horizon in a matter of minutes, rather than the long, lingering dusk Geralt had known his whole life, and with it came a cold that bit through his jacket with unexpected teeth. He'd set himself up in the lee of a boulder outcropping a quarter-mile from Ray's fence line, downwind, patient, silver blade laid bare across his knees, and a handful of the alchemical components he'd managed to scavenge and improvise from local plants arranged within easy reach. It wasn't his full arsenal. Most of his oils and potions were formulated for beasts of his own world, drowners and neckers and the like, and he had no idea yet what local ingredients might substitute for the ones he lacked. But a witcher learned to make do with what a new hunting ground offered, and this one, at least, had given him 3 days to study its flora on the walk-in. He heard it before he saw it, not footsteps, but a kind of displaced silence, the way predators sometimes moved through a landscape so completely that even the wind seemed to part around them without comment. His medallion hummed steadily, climbing in pitch as the presence drew nearer, and something in the pattern of that hum struck him as wrong in a way he couldn't immediately place. Not the alien, unfamiliar chaos of the buried pyramid. Something closer to home. Something that felt, despite every difference of world and blood, almost like him. A creature shaped by forces beyond its choosing, carrying power it had not asked for. The shape that emerged from the dark was humanoid, cloaked, moving in a low crouch across the flats with a fluid, unnatural gait that ate distance far faster than its posture suggested. Geralt's cat eyes picked out details the darkness tried to hide. A face pale and gaunt beneath the hood, eyes that caught what little starlight there was and threw it back with a faint, sickly glow. Hands curled into claws that weren't claws at all, but simply fingers held too long, too tense, in the shape of a man forgetting how to be one. It moved toward the settlement's fence line with unmistakable purpose, and Geralt rose from his cover without hesitation, silver already in hand. "That's far enough," he called out, voice carrying flat and clear across the flats. The figure froze, turned, and for one suspended moment, Geralt found himself looking not into the eyes of a beast, but into something far more familiar and far more troubling. The eyes of a man who had once been something else entirely, wearing his own ruin like a second skin. "You're not one of theirs," the figure rasped, voice cracked from disuse, carrying an edge of something that might once have been discipline and had long since curdled into something closer to madness. "Not imperial." "Not." A flicker of confusion crossed the gaunt face. "What are you?" "Someone hired to stop you killing more farmers," Geralt said evenly, silver held loose and ready. "Whatever you were before that hardly matters to me now." The figure's laugh was a broken, terrible sound. "Before. Yes. Before I had a name. Before I had a creed." One clawed hand rose to brush against a heavy chain at his throat, and Geralt's medallion screamed in recognition, not of the chain itself, but of what hung from it, a cylindrical device, dark and inert, that Geralt somehow understood, with the same instinctive certainty his medallion offered for all things touched by chaos, had once been a weapon of terrible and precise power. "They called me Hunter too, once," the figure continued, drifting closer with that same unnerving, silent gait. "Inquisitor. I found the last embers of a dying order and I snuffed them one by one, because I was told it was righteous, because I was told it was necessary, because I was told." His voice cracked entirely, dissolving into something between a snarl and a sob. "And then they told me I had failed one final test, and they hunted me." Geralt felt something in his chest tighten, not quite pity. He had learned long ago to be careful with pity. It made blades hesitate at the worst possible moments, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. He had met broken hunters before. Witchers who'd lost too much of themselves to the trials. Mercenaries who'd taken one contract too many against their own conscience and never found their way back from it. This galaxy, it seemed, made its own version of that particular tragedy. And this creature standing before him in the dark wore its shape with terrible familiarity. "So you hide out here," Geralt said, keeping his voice level, keeping the silver blade steady, "and kill farmers because it's easier than facing whatever hunts you." They come close, the figure snarled, some of the fractured grief burning away into something sharper, more feral. Every fence I cross, every field I hunt, something in me still reaches for the force even though it's broken in me now, twisted, wrong, and I can feel them. Their fear, their small, simple lives. It is the only warmth I have left. His eyes fixed on Geralt with sudden, hungry focus. But you are not simple. You are not small. What warmth do you carry, stranger? None you'd want to taste, Geralt said, and readied himself as the figure's crouch deepened, muscles coiling. The attack came fast, faster than anything human should move, a blur of cloak and claw that closed the distance in a single bound. Geralt's silver met it in a shower of sparks, the impact jarring up through his arm with far more force than flesh and bone should have carried. The Inquisitor, if that word meant what Geralt guessed it meant, some broken order of hunter turned mad by its own creed, recoiled with a hiss, cradling a shallow gash along one forearm that smoked faintly where silver had touched skin. That burns, the figure snarled, genuine surprise cutting through the madness for just a moment. What is that metal? Something your kind has never had reason to fear before, Geralt said, circling now, reading his opponent's balance, his reach, the particular tell of a fighter whose training had once been rigorous and precise before grief unmade the discipline holding it together. Doesn't mean I have to enjoy killing you. You didn't ask to be what they made you. Don't. The word came out raw, furious. Don't you dare offer me mercy dressed as understanding. I have heard that lie from Jedi and from my own masters both, and it always precedes the blade. Then we understand each other, Geralt said quietly, because I've heard men say that exact same thing right before they made mercy impossible for both of us. The Inquisitor came again, faster this time, one clawed hand crackling suddenly with dark, jagged energy that arced toward Geralt's chest with a sound like tearing fabric. Geralt threw himself sideways, felt the heat of its scorch past his shoulder, and understood in that instant, with the particular clarity violence always offered him, that this was no longer a hunt he could resolve with caution. Whatever chained power still lived in this broken creature, it was rising now, uncoiling toward something far more dangerous than grief. He raised his free hand, silver in the other, and reached, again cautiously, uncertain of the cost, for Quen. The sign answered this time with less resistance than Ard had offered days before, a shimmering barrier of pale light wrapping around him just as a second bolt of that jagged dark energy struck home, absorbed by the ward with a crackle that sang through Geralt's bones like a struck bell. The Inquisitor staggered back, startled anew. You used the Force, the broken man breathed, something almost like reverence bleeding into the madness of his voice. How? When I have felt nothing from you that resembles. I don't know your force, Geralt said, circling again, feeling Quen's ward already beginning to thin. I know mine, and right now it's the only thing standing between your madness and my throat. Above them, unnoticed by either combatant, the twin moons climbed higher over the flats, indifferent witnesses to a fight between two hunters who had each, in their own galaxy, once believed themselves the instrument of something righteous, and had each, in their own way, learned exactly how costly that belief could become. The Inquisitor's dark energy struck Quen's ward a second time, and this time the shield did not simply absorb the blow. It recoiled, a violent pulse of light that threw both combatants backward. Geralt skidding through the dust on his heels, while the broken hunter tumbled and rolled to a crouch several yards distant, snarling low in his throat. Geralt's chest ached with the particular hollow exhaustion he'd felt once before, atop the roof of the listening post. That same sense of drawing on a well shallower than the one he knew at home. Whatever Quen had cost him this time, it had cost more, as though the ward had strained against something the Force itself resisted. Some fundamental incompatibility between his chaos and the dark power crackling from the Inquisitor's clawed hands. Your ward fought my lightning, the Inquisitor said, straightening slowly, something almost delighted cutting through the madness in his ruined voice. I have felt Jedi wards do that. Only Jedi. You are no Jedi. I told you, Geralt said, circling again, feeling the burn of overextension settle into his bones like the ache after a long fever. I don't know your Jedi. I know what's mine, and it doesn't much care what you call it. Then perhaps, the Inquisitor said, and something in his stance shifted. No longer the wild, grief-maddened lunge of before, but something colder, more deliberate, an old discipline reasserting itself through the cracks of his ruin. We should discover exactly what it is. He came again, and this time there was method in the violence. A faint low that became a strike high, dark energy crackling along both hands now rather than one, forked lightning arcing toward Geralt from two directions at once. Geralt had no time for Quen again, not so soon, not with the ward's cost still throbbing behind his ribs like a bruise pressed too hard. He threw himself sideways instead, silver flashing up to deflect one arc of energy in a shower of white sparks that scorched a line across his palm even through the glove, and felt the second bolt catch him across the ribs. Pain exploded through his side, sharper and stranger than any wound blade or claw had given him. Not the clean agony of torn flesh, but something that burned inward, toward bone, toward the very nerve of him, as though the lightning sought not merely to wound, but to unmake. He staggered, breath tearing out of him in a ragged gasp, and understood with sudden, grim clarity exactly why the officer at the listening post had called men like this one lord and spoken his name with dread. This is not a beast, he thought, forcing himself upright through sheer stubborn will. Silver still gripped tight, despite fingers gone half-numb. This is something that could kill 100 lesser men without breaking stride, wearing the wreckage of grief as a mask for what it still is underneath. He had fought things like that before, too. The mask never mattered, in the end. Only the wreckage did. "You're strong," the Inquisitor said, advancing with slow, savoring steps now, clearly reading the pain written plain across Geralt's face. "Stronger than any farmer, any settler, any of the small warm things I have hunted across this miserable rock. Perhaps that is why I have not yet killed you. It has been so long since anything gave me a true fight." "Careful," Geralt rasped, forcing his stance back into readiness despite the fire in his side. "Wanting a fight is usually how men like you get the ending they were avoiding." "Men like me want an ending," the Inquisitor snarled. And for a moment the cold discipline cracked entirely, grief and rage boiling back to the surface in a raw, ragged wound of a voice. "I was promised purpose. I was promised that erasing what I once was would make me whole. Instead, I am neither hunter nor hunted, neither Jedi nor Sith, neither man nor monster. Only this starving, endless this." Geralt understood, in that moment, with the particular weary clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime meeting monsters that had once been men, exactly what kind of ending this fight was truly circling. He had met witchers driven mad by the trials, driven past whatever thin thread of humanity the mutations had left them. He had met sorcerers who'd traded away pieces of themselves for power and found the trade cost more than they'd bargained. He knew, with bone-deep certainty, that there was no version of this conversation that ended with the Inquisitor walking away whole. But he also knew, and this was the harder truth, the one that had cost him more sleep over the decades than any monster's claws ever had, that killing something broken was not always the same as killing something evil. Sometimes it was simply the only mercy left on the table. "I'm not going to pretend I can fix what they did to you," Geralt said, lowering his silver a fraction, not in surrender, but in something closer to acknowledgement. "I've met enough of your kind, broken by other people's purposes, to know that's not a thing outsiders can undo. But I can end the hunting. I can end the fear you're putting into that village's fence line every night. That's the only mercy I've got in my kit." The Inquisitor went very still. For a long moment, the only sound on the flats was wind hissing over dust, and the distant, uncaring creak of a moisture vaporator somewhere beyond the fence line, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in its shadow. "Mercy," the Inquisitor said at last, and something in his ruined voice had gone quiet, almost thoughtful, the madness receding just far enough to let something older and sadder show through the cracks. "Do you know, stranger, I do not think anyone has offered me that word without a blade following close behind it. Not since the temple fell." "I'm not most people," Geralt said, "and this is still going to end with a blade. I just wanted you to know it wasn't hatred swinging it." The Inquisitor's laugh, when it came, was soft and horribly sane, and somehow more unsettling than any of the madness that had come before it. "Then let it be an honest ending, at least. Small mercy. I have had far worse offered to me in this galaxy, by far gentler-seeming men. He came at Geralt one final time, not with the wild fury of before, but with a strange, deliberate slowness, as though some part of him had already decided the shape this ending would take, and simply wished to meet it, standing rather than fleeing. Geralt met the strike with silver raised, chaos and force colliding in one last violent flare of light across the dark flats, and when the light faded, only one hunter remained standing beneath the twin moons, breathing hard, silver blade lowered, chest and side burning with wounds that would take days to properly heal. He stood over the fallen Inquisitor for a long moment, listening to the wind, feeling the particular hollow weight that always followed a kill that hadn't felt like victory. Then, slowly, he crouched and unclasped the dark cylindrical weapon from the dead man's chain, turning it over in his hands, studying its cold, inert weight with the same careful curiosity he'd once turned on relics and grimoires half a world, half a galaxy away. Whatever this device was, whatever power it channeled when its owner still lived to wield it, Geralt suspected it would not be the last time this galaxy asked him to carry away the pieces of something it had broken beyond repair. Somewhere beyond the fence line, Ray's homestead lights flickered against the dark, unaware yet that the thing stalking their fields would trouble them no more, and unaware, too, that word of tonight's fight would already be spreading through channels far beyond a single frightened settlement, carried by sensors and holonet chatter toward ears that would find a lone stranger wielding both silver and something that burned like the Force itself entirely too interesting to ignore. The proof Ray wanted came in the shape of the dead Inquisitor's chain and the strange cylindrical weapon Geralt had claimed from his body. Evidence enough, though the old farmer's face went pale and wordless when he saw it laid out on his kitchen table by lantern light. "That's a lightsaber hilt," Ray said finally, voice hushed, backing half a step away, as though the inert cylinder might still bite him. "You killed an Inquisitor?" "I killed something that used to be a hunter and had stopped being able to tell the difference between hunting and starving," Geralt said, too tired for the finer points of local terminology. "Whatever you call it, your fence line's safe now." Word, as it turned out, did not stay contained to a single settlement for long. Geralt learned this the following morning, seated at Ray's table over a meal that tasted of nothing he recognized and everything he was grateful for regardless, when a young man burst through the door breathless from running the length of the settlement. "Holonet's talking about it," the boy gasped. Some trader picked up chatter off an Imperial channel. "They're saying a lone fighter killed a fallen Inquisitor out past the flats, calling him the White Wolf on account of some Imperial scout's report describing his heir." The boy's eyes found Geralt across the table, wide with the particular awe reserved for the suddenly, unexpectedly legendary. "That's you, isn't it?" Geralt set down his cup slowly, feeling something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the meal. He had lived long enough on the continent to know exactly what it meant when a name, even an improvised, ill-fitting one, began traveling faster than the man who carried it. Names drew attention. Attention drew offers. Offers drew obligations he had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. "How far's this chatter traveled?" he asked. "Far as the relay tower's reach," the boy said, clearly not grasping the weight of the question beneath it. "My cousin says even the rebellions picked it up. Says there's cells out past the Ison corridor already talking about recruiting you." Ray's expression darkened at that, the practical worry of a settler who understood, better than his son did, exactly what kind of trouble followed men whose names traveled on both Imperial and Rebel channels at once. "You should move on soon as you're able," the old farmer said quietly, once the boy had run off to spread the news further. "Not because we're not grateful, Force knows we are, but because Imperial patrols don't take kindly to independent contractors who kill their Inquisitors, no matter how mad that Inquisitor had gone. And Rebels aren't much better about leaving alone anyone useful enough to be worth recruiting by force if persuasion fails." "I've had that particular conversation with kings and mages both," Geralt said, feeling old and weary in a way that had nothing to do with his wounds, which had already begun the accelerated healing his mutations always granted him. "It usually ends the same way regardless of what banner the offer flies under." He rested 3 more days at Ray's homestead, long enough to let the worst of the Inquisitor's lightning burn scar over, long enough to trade information for information. ray filling in the broad shape of a galaxy at war with itself, an empire built on fear and order, a scattered rebellion built on hope and desperation, and beneath both of them, older and stranger, whispers of a force that touched everything and answered to neither side cleanly. It was, Geralt reflected, distressingly familiar. Every world he'd ever walked seemed to eventually resolve into the same tired shape. Powerful men convinced their cause justified any cost, and ordinary people caught in the grinding space between those certainties. On the fourth morning, as Geralt shouldered his gear and prepared to move on toward whatever settlement or contract awaited him next, a shadow crossed the flats that had nothing to do with weather. The speeder that set down at the settlement's edge bore no imperial markings, sleek and dark, its idling engine a low predatory purr that drew every eye in the village toward it. Two figures disembarked, not soldiers, not farmers, but something in between, dressed in mismatched armor plate that Geralt practiced, I read instantly as mercenary rather than military, each movement carrying the unhurried confidence of people used to being the most dangerous thing in any room they entered. "That's not good," Ray murmured, coming to stand beside Geralt in the homestead's doorway. The taller of the two mercenaries, a broad-shouldered woman with a scarred jaw and an easy, predatory smile, scanned the settlement until her gaze found Geralt and settled there with the satisfied look of someone whose search had just concluded successfully. "White Wolf," she called out, voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "Word is you're looking for work. We represent an employer who pays a great deal better than moisture farmers." Geralt felt Ray tense beside him and set a hand briefly on the old man's shoulder, a small, silent reassurance, before stepping forward to meet the mercenaries himself, silver riding easy at his hip, steel at the other. "I'm listening," he said. "Doesn't mean I'm buying." The woman's smile widened, the particular expression of someone who had heard that exact sentence from 100 wary contractors before and had never yet failed to change their mind. "Everyone's buying eventually," she said. "Our employer just makes sure the price is worth paying." Behind her, her partner said nothing at all, simply watched Geralt with a flat, assessing stare of a man cataloging exactly how much of a problem this legendary stranger might become if the conversation went poorly. And Geralt, reading that same calculation in return, understood with weary certainty that this was only the first of many such offers this galaxy intended to make him. He had turned down kings before. He suspected, before this was through, he would need every ounce of that same stubbornness again. For a long moment, the only sound on the flats was wind hissing over dust, and the distant, uncaring creak of a moisture vaporator somewhere beyond the fence line, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in its shadow. "Mercy," the Inquisitor said at last, and something in his ruined voice had gone quiet, almost thoughtful, the madness receding just far enough to let something older and sadder show through the cracks. "Do you know, stranger, I do not think anyone has offered me that word without a blade following close behind it. Not since the temple fell." "I'm not most people," Geralt said, "and this is still going to end with a blade. I just wanted you to know it wasn't hatred swinging it." The Inquisitor's laugh, when it came, was soft and horribly sane, and somehow more unsettling than any of the madness that had come before it. "Then let it be an honest ending, at least. Small mercy. I have had far worse offered to me in this galaxy, by far gentler seeming men." He came at Geralt one final time, not with the wild fury of before, but with a strange, deliberate slowness, as though some part of him had already decided the shape this ending would take, and simply wished to meet it, standing rather than fleeing. Geralt met the strike with silver raised, chaos and force colliding in one last violent flare of light across the dark flats, and when the light faded, only one hunter remained standing beneath the twin moons, breathing hard, silver blade lowered, chest and side burning with wounds that would take days to properly heal. He stood over the fallen Inquisitor for a long moment, listening to the wind, feeling the particular hollow weight that always followed a kill that hadn't felt like victory. Then, slowly, he crouched and unclasped the dark cylindrical weapon from the dead man's chain, turning it over in his hands, studying its cold, inert weight with the same careful curiosity he'd once turned on relics and grimoires half a world, half a galaxy, away. Whatever this device was, whatever power it channeled when its owner still lived to wield it, Geralt suspected it would not be the last time this galaxy asked him to carry away the pieces of something it had broken beyond repair. Somewhere beyond the fence line, Ray's homestead lights flickered against the dark, unaware yet that the thing stalking their fields would trouble them no more, and unaware, too, that word of tonight's fight would already be spreading through channels far beyond a single frightened settlement, carried by sensors and Holland chatter toward ears that would find a lone stranger wielding both silver and something that burned like the Force itself entirely too interesting to ignore. The mercenaries called themselves Vess and Toro. She did the talking, he did the watching. And it took them less than a minute of easy conversation to reveal exactly what kind of employer had sent them chasing rumors of a lone fighter who'd killed a fallen inquisitor with a sword. Granda the Hutt controls most of the trade routes through this sector, Vess said, settling onto an overturned crate outside Ray's homestead with the easy familiarity of someone accustomed to negotiating in dust and heat. He's got an interest in talent, independent talent, especially. The kind that doesn't answer to imperial chains of command or rebellion ideology. I don't work for crime lords, Geralt said. You don't work for anyone yet, from what I hear. Vess's grin didn't waver. That's exactly why Granda's interested. A blade that answers to coin and conscience both, and not to any banner. That's rare in this galaxy, White Wolf. Most people who can fight like you've apparently fought get scooped up by one side or the other before they've had time to develop opinions of their own. Geralt had heard this particular pitch before, dressed in different words, but wearing the same shape. Noblemen who wanted a monster on a leash, merchants who wanted muscle, without the inconvenience of a conscience attached to it. He'd learned, across a long and often bloody education, exactly how such offers tended to age once the coin actually changed hands. "What's the job?" he said, "before I decide whether I care about the offer wrapped around it." Vess's smile sharpened with genuine appreciation, as though she respected a man who skipped straight to the transaction rather than pretending flattery might work on him. "There's a Pike Syndicate shipment moving through this sector next week. Granda wants it intercepted before it reaches its buyers, spice mostly. But there's something else in that cargo hold he's more interested in. An artifact. Pre-Imperial. His scouts think it might be Force-related." She watched him carefully as she said it, gauging his reaction. "Given your talents, we thought you'd have a professional interest." Geralt's jaw tightened, thinking of the pyramid in the buried chamber, the projected grief of robed figures losing a war he still didn't understand. What happens to the artifact once you have it? Granda sells it, to the highest bidder, whoever that turns out to be. Vess shrugged, the gesture of someone entirely unbothered by the question's implied morality. Could be an imperial collector. Could be some rebel cell desperate for anything that might turn the tide. Granda doesn't care about the war, White Wolf. He cares about profit, and profit doesn't take sides. Neither, from what I hear, do you. There it was, the leash, disguised as freedom. Geralt had smelled it coming since the moment Vess said the word employer, and now here it sat in plain view, an offer to remain neutral in name only, while his blade did the bidding of a man who profited from selling ancient griefs to whichever side of a war paid more for them. "I don't care about your war," Geralt said slowly, "but I care what gets done with things I don't understand yet. That artifact could be nothing. Could be a grave marker, like the one I already found buried under an Imperial base 3 days from here. Could be something a lot more dangerous, sitting in the hands of whoever writes the biggest check." He shook his head. "I'm not in the business of arming strangers with things I can't predict the cost of." Vess's easy smile finally faltered, just slightly, replaced by something more calculating. Granda doesn't take rejection gracefully, White Wolf. He's not the kind of employer who forgets a face that said no to him. "I've made worse enemies than crime lords for smaller reasons," Geralt said. "I'll take my chances." Toro spoke for the first time then, voice low and flat. "You understand this isn't really a negotiation. Granda sent us to recruit you. Politely, if you're reasonable. Less politely if you're not." Geralt's hand drifted unhurried toward the hilt at his hip, not a threat exactly, but a plain and unmistakable statement of where this conversation would go if less politely became the mercenaries' chosen path. "You're welcome to try the less polite version," he said evenly. "I'd rather you didn't on account of these people." A small nod toward the settlement behind him, toward Ray's homestead and the frightened, curious faces watching from doorways and windows, who don't deserve to catch stray fire over a job I've already turned down. For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. Vess's eyes flicked toward the settlement, toward the gathered witnesses, doing the same calculation Geralt had learned to read in every hired blade he'd ever faced down, weighing the value of forcing the issue against the cost of a fight that would leave bodies and questions neither Grandu nor his employers particularly wanted attached to a job gone loud and public. "Your loss," Vess said at last, rising smoothly from a crate, the easy charm sliding back over her expression like a mask reapplied. "Grandu will find someone else to fetch his artifact. But he'll remember the name White Wolf, and I wouldn't count on that memory working in your favor down the line." "I've survived worse grudges," Geralt said. The mercenaries retreated to their speeder without further argument, engines kicking up a fine spray of dust as they lifted off and banked away toward the horizon, leaving Geralt standing in the settlement's dusty street with Ray at his shoulder and the weight of a decision he suspected he hadn't heard the last consequences of. "You just turned down a hut," Ray said quietly, equal parts awe and alarm in his voice. "Wouldn't be the first crime lord to hold a grudge against me," Geralt said, watching the speeder shrink to a dark speck against the pale sky. "Won't be the last either, I imagine, in a galaxy this size." But even as he said it, turning the words over with the particular weariness of a man measuring the cost of his own principles, he found himself thinking again of the buried pyramid's projected grief, robed figures losing a war, a boy with trembling hands holding a blade of light, a single impression pressed into his mind like a brand. The war does not end. It only sleeps. Whatever artifact the Pike Syndicate carried through this sector, whatever hands it eventually fell into, Geralt suspected this would not be the last time this galaxy's buried griefs crossed paths with men who saw only profit in disturbing them. He filed the thought away, the way he filed away every loose thread that might someday demand his attention again, and turned his mind instead to the more immediate problem of finding somewhere safer than an increasingly famous settlement to spend the next several nights. Fame, he was quickly learning, traveled faster in this galaxy than even the worst rumors on the continent ever had, and it was only a matter of time before an offer arrived that wouldn't take no so gracefully as Granda's mercenaries just had. The offer that wouldn't take no so gracefully arrived 4 days later, in a settlement 3 valleys east of Ray's homestead, delivered not by mercenaries, but by a woman who introduced herself simply as Pharaoh and carried herself with the particular coiled watchfulness of someone who had survived more firefights than conversations. She found him in a cantina, the settlement's single gathering place, a low-roofed building thick with a smell of fried food and cheap fuel alcohol, exactly the kind of establishment Geralt had learned to seek out in every world he'd ever walked, since taverns and their equivalents always seemed to carry news faster than any official channel. She slid onto the bench across from him without invitation, set a data slate on the table between them, and got straight to business in a way Geralt found he respected rather more than Vess's practiced charm. "You're the one who killed the fallen Inquisitor," she said. "Not a question. Word travels. Word travels fastest to people who need it to." Pharaoh's eyes were tired in the particular way of someone who had spent too many nights awake weighing costs that had no good answer. "I'm with a cell operating out of the Ison corridor. We've got a problem, and we think you're the kind of problem solver who doesn't ask the questions that usually get in the way." Geralt set down his cup, already recognizing the shape of what was coming, the particular careful phrasing of people about to ask for something they knew, on some level, they shouldn't be asking. "Say what you need." "There's an Imperial garrison 2 systems from here, sitting on a supply line that's been strangling 3 separate settlements for the better part of a year, requisitioning their crops, their water, conscripting able hands into labor details that don't come back healthy, if they come back at all." Pharaoh's jaw tightened. "We've tried sabotage, tried intercepting supply runs. The garrison just tightens its grip harder every time, makes examples of whoever they catch. We need something that hits harder, quieter, faster than blaster fire. Something that takes the whole garrison off the board without giving them time to retaliate against the settlements first." "What are you asking me to do?" Pharaoh met his eyes without flinching, and Geralt respected that too, even as the shape of the request settled into place with grim inevitability. Their water reclamation system serves the whole garrison. We've got access to a compound. Imperial chemists developed it. We captured a shipment of it last month. That would render their water supply lethal within hours. No blaster fire. No siege. No settlement caught in a crossfire. Just a garrison that wakes up sick and dies before they ever know what hit them. The cantina noise seemed to recede around Geralt as he sat with the request, weighing it the way he weighed every contract that arrived wrapped in justification, every offer that promised a clean solution to an ugly problem. He had heard versions of this exact argument before, from desperate villagers who wanted a rival poisoned rather than confronted, from lords who wanted a whole bloodline quietly ended rather than fought openly. The logic always sounded reasonable in the telling. It was the execution that revealed what such logic actually cost. How many men in that garrison? He asked. 200 maybe. Soldiers mostly. Some support staff, techs, administrators. Pharaoh's voice hardened slightly, anticipating his objection. They're the ones starving 3 settlements to feed the Empire's war machine. They've made their choice. Administrators, Geralt repeated quietly. Techs. People who signed up to fix machinery and file requisition forms, not to kill anyone. They wear the uniform. They benefit from what that uniform does to people who don't have the luxury of choosing sides. So did every conscripted farm boy I've ever met wearing a lord's colors because refusing meant his family starved, Geralt said. I've killed men before who deserved it. I've refused to kill men who wore the wrong colors, but hadn't yet done anything to earn a blade in the dark. There's a difference, and poison in a well doesn't know how to tell it apart. Pharaoh's expression flickered between frustration and something more raw, the particular exhaustion of someone who had run out of options that let her sleep easily at night, and had decided, reluctantly, that sleep was a luxury the settlements under that garrison's boot couldn't currently afford. You think I want this to be the answer? I've buried people, because that garrison decided making an example mattered more than mercy. I'm not asking you to enjoy it. I'm asking you to help us end something that's already killing people slowly, by killing it quickly instead. I understand the arithmetic, Geralt said. And he did. He'd done that same grim math 100 times across 100 contracts, weighing lesser evils against greater ones, choosing the option that cost the fewest innocent lives even when every option on the table cost something. It was a calculation he'd made his peace with long ago, in principle. But principle had limits, and this crossed one he'd drawn for himself decades before this galaxy had even existed as a place he might one day fall into. But poisoning a water supply doesn't discriminate between the soldier who's made peace with cruelty and the 18-year-old conscript scrubbing latrines because the alternative was worse for his family. That's not a contract. That's a massacre with better public relations. So what would you do instead? Pharaoh's voice had an edge now, sharp with the particular anger of someone whose desperate solution had just been called by its true name. Walk in the front door and fight 200 soldiers with a sword? Maybe, Geralt said. Or find the specific chain of command actually giving the orders that are starving your settlements, and make the cost of those orders personal to the people giving them, instead of collective punishment against everyone standing nearby wearing the same uniform. He shook his head slowly. I don't know your galaxy's politics well enough yet to promise you a clean answer. But I know the poison well isn't one, whatever arithmetic you've built to justify it. Pharaoh was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, clearly turning his refusal over with the particular fury of someone who had hoped, against her better judgment, that this legendary stranger might simply solve her problem, without forcing her to examine its cost more closely. You understand, she said finally, voice low, that turning us down doesn't make the garrison stop starving those settlements. It just means we keep looking for someone with fewer scruples than you've got. I understand that, Geralt said, and meant it, feeling the particular hollow weight of a refusal that solved nothing except his own conscience. I've made that same trade before, more times than I'd like to count, walked away from a job because the cost was wrong, and watched someone with fewer scruples take it instead. It never stopped mattering to me, but it never once made the wrong choice into the right one either. Pharaoh rose from the bench without another word, gathering her data slate, and left the cantina without a farewell, her retreating back carrying the particular stiffness of someone who had hoped for an ally and found, instead, only another obstacle in an already exhausting war. Geralt sat alone with his drink long after she'd gone, turning the conversation over in his mind, feeling the familiar, unwelcome weight settle across his shoulders, the weight of having made an enemy of people who weren't wrong to be desperate, over a principle they weren't wrong to resent him for holding. He had made that trade before. He suspected, with the particular weariness of a man who had learned exactly how expensive his own conscience tended to be, that this galaxy would ask him to make it again and again until something finally broke, either the war around him or the stubborn line he kept refusing to cross. Outside the cantina, the twin suns were setting, casting long violet shadows across a settlement that would go on starving regardless of what any one wandering hunter chose or refused to do about it. And Geralt found himself, not for the first time since falling through that rift, wondering exactly how many more lines like this one the galaxy intended to draw in front of him before it finally forced him to choose a side after all. The rumor that led him to the canyon did not sound like a contract at all. Not at first. Just another thread of Hollonet chatter overheard in a trading post 3 settlements west of Ray's homestead, half lost beneath talk of imperial requisitions and grain prices. A trader mentioned, almost in passing, a canyon system in the Badlands where moisture farmers refused to send their herds, not from fear of beasts, but from something stranger. Livestock that wandered near the canyon mouth returned calmer than they'd left, and children who grew up in nearby settlements sometimes spoke of dreams that came true a day early, dreams they were taught, quietly and urgently, never to mention to a soldier. Geralt had not gone looking for it on purpose. He told himself that afterward, and mostly believed it. He had been 3 weeks on the road since Pharaoh walked out of that cantina without a farewell, taking whatever contracts came honest and small, a nest of venomous burrowers driving a settlement's livestock mad, a smuggler's cache guarded by something with too many legs and an appetite for anything that moved. Ordinary work, the kind that let a man's hands stay busy and his conscience stay quiet. But his medallion had other opinions about ordinary. And 3 days out from his last contract it had begun to hum, not the violent alarm of the sublevel chamber beneath the listening post, not the alien wrongness of the pyramid in its basin, but something softer, warmer, a low resonant note that pulled at him the way a familiar tune pulls at a man half asleep in a tavern 3 towns from home. He followed it, telling himself he was only curious, the way he had told himself 100 times before that he was only curious about some glowing wisp in a swamp or some crumbling shrine half swallowed by moss. And every one of those times the curiosity had cost him blood, coin, or sleep in equal measure. He expected no different here. He was not disappointed in that expectation, though the shape of the cost would prove larger than anything he'd yet paid in this galaxy. The canyon opened before him at dusk, walls of red-veined stone rising sheer on either side, and at its heart, tucked into an overhang that no orbital scan would easily catch, sat a cluster of dwellings built from salvaged transport hulls and quarried stone, smoke rising thin and careful from vents designed to scatter rather than plume. It was a settlement built by people who understood, with a particular fluency of the hunted, exactly how to stay unseen. He felt the eyes on him before he saw the watcher. A boy no older than 9, perched on an outcropping above the canyon's mouth, utterly still in a way that no ordinary child achieved by accident. Geralt raised his empty hands, the old gesture, and waited. "You're the one from a Hollonet," the boy called down, voice carrying an odd, careful evenness that didn't match his age. "The White Wolf. Mirren said you might come." "Mirren know I was coming before I did?" "She usually does." The boy's grin flashed, quick and real despite the strange stillness underneath it. "She's waiting." Mirren Vey met him at the settlement's edge. A woman perhaps 50 years old by the reckoning of a world Geralt still didn't fully understand. Gray threaded through dark hair, cropped close and practical, dressed and patched, unremarkable clothes that gave no hint of what she had once been until Geralt's medallion hummed against his chest at her approach, steady and warm, the way it hummed near old, settled magic that had made a long peace with its own power. "You feel it," she said, without preamble, watching his hand drift briefly to the silver wolf at his throat. Good. It saves us both a difficult conversation about what I am. I've had that conversation with mages, priestesses, and one particularly talkative hedge witch who insisted on reading my future from goat entrails, Geralt said. I can manage it again if you'd rather. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her weathered face. I was a Jedi Knight once, before the temple fell, before the order came that turned soldiers I'd trained beside into executioners overnight. I felt it happen. Every Jedi who survived that day felt it. A scream through the Force that never fully stopped echoing. She said it plainly, without the theatrical grief Geralt had half expected from the way galaxy-wide holonet chatter spoke of that event in hushed, reverent tones. This was simply a fact she had learned to carry, the way a man learns to carry an old wound that aches before rain. I've spent 18 years since finding children the Empire hasn't found yet. Children born with the same gift that got my brothers and sisters slaughtered. I hide them. I teach them what little I dare to teach, and I pray it's enough to keep them alive until they're old enough to hide themselves. Geralt let his gaze travel the canyon settlement. A dozen structures, perhaps 30 souls by rough count, children mostly, ranging from toddlers barely walking to a handful old enough to help tend what passed for crops in the canyon's shaded terraces. How many are like the boy on the ridge, feeling things before they happen? All of them, to some degree. Some barely a flicker, a knack for finding lost things, an instinct for danger a half second before it arrives. Others, her gaze found a girl of perhaps 12 sitting apart from the others, watching Geralt with an intensity that made his medallions hum sharpen. Others carry more than I know how to safely teach them to carry. That one, Geralt said. It wasn't a question. Tamsin. She came to us 4 years ago, the sole survivor of a settlement the Empire burned looking for exactly what she is. She has more raw strength in her than any child I've trained, and less control over it than I'd like, and I have been dreading every day since she arrived. The day something finally forces that strength to the surface where the wrong eyes might see it. Mirren's expression, for the first time, showed something like fear beneath its careful composure. That day may already be coming, White Wolf. That's why I sought you out. Geralt felt the old, familiar weight settle across his shoulders, the weight of a request he had not yet agreed to, and already suspected he could not walk away from. Sought me out how? I only decided to follow this canyon 3 days ago. You didn't decide anything, Mirren said. The Force doesn't work that cleanly, not for people like me, and I suspect not for whatever moves in you either, chaos or otherwise. I've felt something drawing closer to this canyon for weeks. Not danger exactly, not at first, just a presence with a gravity to it, the kind the Force sometimes lends to people who matter to a moment before they know it themselves. When the holonet chatter about a lone fighter who killed a fallen Inquisitor reached us, I put the pieces together faster than I'd like to admit I wanted to. She held his gaze, unflinching in a way Geralt found he respected. The same quality he'd noted in Pharaoh before their conversation soured into refusal. I'm not asking you to be a Jedi or a soldier or anything you don't already choose to be. I'm asking you to help me get these children somewhere safer than a canyon that Imperial patrols are searching with steadily increasing thoroughness, before whatever gravity brought you here also brings something far less welcome in your wake. You think I led them to you? I think a dead Inquisitor and a stranger wielding power the Force doesn't recognize is exactly the kind of anomaly the Inquisitorius exists to hunt down, Mirren said, and I think you have already met the man who leads that hunt, whether you knew his name or not. Geralt went very still, the memory surfacing unbidden, the courtyard at the listening post, the officer's data slate, the words Lord Vanler. He's already inbound spoken with a stiffness that had nothing to do with courtesy. Vanler. You know the name. I know it the way you know a storm by the color of the sky before it breaks, Geralt said. Never met the man. Heard him mentioned once, by people who clearly wished they hadn't had reason to. Then you understand why I didn't wait for a formal introduction before asking a stranger with a reputation for killing Inquisitors to walk into my canyon and help me move 30 children somewhere he can't find them. Mirren's voice carried no apology in it, only the flat exhaustion of a woman who had run out of better options and made her peace with the cost of the one remaining. I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't your fight, and I know you've already refused 2 very reasonable-sounding offers this season, according to the same chatter that told me your name. You've been keeping close track of my refusals. I keep close track of anyone the Empire and the Rebellion both want badly enough to send recruiters after, Mirren said. It tells me a great deal about a person's character, watching what they turn down. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Tamsin, still watching from her distance, and something in the careful composure cracked just enough to show the raw fear beneath it. I'm not offering you coin, White Wolf. I have precious little of it to offer. I'm offering you the truth, which is that these children will very likely die if the wrong hunter finds this canyon before we've moved them somewhere safer. And I have exhausted every resource I know how to muster on my own after 18 years of trying. Geralt looked past her, toward the canyon's small gathering of dwellings, toward children who moved with the careful quiet of the perpetually hidden even in play, toward a girl of 12 carrying more raw power than her guardian knew how to safely teach her, and felt something old and familiar stir beneath his ribs, a feeling he had first learned on a windswept battlefield decades and a world away, holding a child he had never asked for and would never regret claiming. He had told himself, more than once since falling through that rift, that this galaxy's war was not his to fight, that every offer wrapped in righteous cause was still, underneath, someone else's leash disguised as purpose. But this was not a cause. This was not a banner, or an ideology, or a crime lord's profit margin dressed up as neutrality. This was 30 children who had done nothing but be born wrong in the eyes of an empire that murdered its own soldiers for the crime of aging past usefulness. I'm not promising I can outrun an Inquisitor's hunting party forever, Geralt said slowly, feeling the shape of the decision settle into place even as he spoke it, the same weary, inevitable click he'd felt 100 times before when duty and choice turned out, against all his careful efforts at neutrality, to be the same thing after all. I've killed one of them. I don't know yet what it costs to kill more, or whether this galaxy's strange kind of magic will let me manage it twice. But you'll try. I'll try, Geralt said, and felt the words settle into him with the particular finality of a vow he already suspected he would bleed for. Show me the terrain. Show me every path in and out of this canyon, every place a scanner could catch a heat signature, every child too young to run fast if it comes to running. If Vanther's coming, I want to know this ground better than he does before he ever sets a boot on it. Mirren studied him for a long moment, something like cautious relief warring with the fear still etched into the lines of her face, and then nodded once, sharp and decisive, the gesture of a soldier accepting terms she'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. Then come. There's a great deal to show you, and I suspect we have less time than either of us would like. Behind her, the girl called Tamsin rose from her perch and crossed the canyon floor with slow, deliberate steps, stopping a few paces from Geralt and regarding him with the frank, unguarded curiosity only children seem to manage in any world, any galaxy, any language. You really killed an Inquisitor, she said. Not a question. The same flat certainty Pharaoh had once offered him, though there was none of Pharaoh's wariness in it, only a child's blunt fascination with the shape of a legend standing in front of her. I killed something that used to be a hunter, Geralt said, echoing the same answer he'd given Ray weeks and a lifetime ago, and had stopped being able to tell hunting from suffering. Tamsin considered that with a solemnity that sat strangely on so young a face. Mirren says you're not a Jedi, not a Sith either. What are you then? Geralt looked down at her, at the raw power he could feel humming beneath her skin even without a medallion's help to name it, and thought unbidden of another girl once, small, fierce, marked by power she hadn't asked for and hadn't yet learned to carry, and felt the old ache of that memory settle alongside this new one, galaxies apart and somehow, impossibly, the same weight exactly. Someone who's done this before, he said quietly. A long time ago. Different stars. He did not elaborate further, and Tamsin, with the particular wisdom children sometimes carried without knowing its name, did not ask him to. She only nodded, as though the answer satisfied something in her that questions alone could not have reached, and turned to lead him deeper into the canyon, toward the paths and the children and the mounting, inevitable shape of a war Geralt of Rivia had spent this entire galaxy so far trying not to choose, and had, in the space of a single conversation, chosen anyway. Lord Vandher had not become what he was by trusting coincidence, and the pattern accumulating on his tactical display over the past several weeks had long since stopped resembling coincidence to a mind trained by the dark side to see the shape of the force's currents, even when lesser men saw only scattered, unrelated data. He stood in the command hold of his interdicta pattern cruiser, arms folded within the sleeve of his charcoal robes, and studied the star chart projected in cold blue light before him, a scatter of red markers across a single sector of the outer rim, each one a data point his instincts refused to dismiss as random. A listening post breached from a sealed sublevel chamber, its contents unaccounted for, its guards' reports of the incident so contradictory they read almost like men describing different events entirely. A fallen inquisitor, gone dark years ago and presumed a lost cause not worth the resources to hunt, found dead on a moisture farm at the hands of some anomaly the local holonet had already, with typical provincial imprecision, mythologized into a folk hero. And now, threading through both incidents like a single dark filament pulled taut across the sector, a rising hum in the force itself, faint, diffuse, the kind of pressure Vandher had learned across 2 decades of hunting to recognize as the signature of concealment. Someone, somewhere in this sector, was hiding something the force did not want hidden. "You're certain of the convergence," said the officer beside him, Commander Risselane, the same woman who had first flagged Geralt's arrival at the listening post weeks before, transferred now to Vanther's flagship at his own request, her competence having made a favorable enough impression to survive her superior's habitual disdain for ordinary military personnel. "I am certain that 3 anomalies in one sector within the space of 2 months is not coincidence," Vandher said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man for whom emotion had long ago been filed away as an inefficiency rather than eliminated as a weakness. "The force does not scatter its disturbances randomly, Commander, whatever your sensor logs might suggest to a mind untrained in reading them. Something is gathering in this sector. Someone is protecting it. And a stranger with power the scanners cannot classify has twice now demonstrated a willingness to kill in its defense." "The White Wolf." Elaine said the name with a faint, involuntary distaste of an officer who had watched a local legend grow large enough to embarrass Imperial patrols that had, on 2 separate occasions now, failed to apprehend its subject. "Command's grown tired of hearing the name on intercepted rebel chatter, my lord. There's pressure from the sector governor to resolve this before the story grows any larger." "The story is irrelevant." Vanther's gaze did not leave the star chart. "What is relevant is that a fallen inquisitor, one of my own failed hunts, left to rot in the outer rim rather than properly terminated, an oversight I intend to correct in myself going forward, was killed by something the force itself flinched away from when I attempted to trace the confrontation's residue. Not Jedi, not Sith. Something else entirely, something my training has no ready name for, and I have hunted enough anomalies across enough sectors to know that unnamed things are always, without exception, more dangerous than the named ones we've already learned to counter." He turned from the star chart at last, robes whispering across the deck, and regarded Elaine with the particular attention that had made even seasoned officers report a chill down their spine in his presence, though Vandher himself would have dismissed the sensation as superstition rather than anything the force actually granted him beyond simple, honest perceptiveness. "You flagged the original dimensional flux reading. You've tracked the traitor chatter since. Tell me your honest assessment, Commander, not the one you think Imperial protocol requires of you." Elaine hesitated only a moment before answering, a hesitation Vandher noted, and, for reasons even he could not entirely articulate, chose not to punish. "I think there's a concentration of force sensitives hiding somewhere in the outer Badlands, my lord. Refugee networks have been rumored in that region since the purge began, old wives' tales, mostly, dismissed by command as low priority. I think your White Wolf found them or was drawn to them, and I think whatever killed that Inquisitor is now standing between your hunting party and whatever's being hidden out there." "An accurate assessment," Vandher said, and something in the words carried the closest approximation to approval his voice ever managed. "Assemble the hunting party. Full complement. I want 2 additional Inquisitors pulled from the sector reserve, purge trooper support, And every probe droid this ship carries deployed across the Badlands in a search grid within the hour. Whatever is hiding out there has had 18 years, by my estimate of the refugee network's likely origin, to grow patient and careful. I do not intend to grant it an 18th year to compound that patience. And the White Wolf, my lord? Command's official position remains recruitment, if it can be managed without further incident. Vanther's expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness sharpened, the particular focus of a predator recalculating the shape of prey it had, until this moment, considered merely an obstacle rather than a genuine curiosity. Command's official position is a courtesy I am no longer inclined to extend. Whatever this creature is, it wields a power the Force itself recoils from cataloging cleanly, and it has now killed one of my own twice, once in truth, and once in the sense that it has made a mockery of every subsequent attempt to bring it to heel through diplomacy. I will not offer it employment a third time. He turned back toward the star chart, toward the cluster of red markers converging, in his estimation, toward a single point in the Badlands his search grid would find within days rather than weeks. I will simply end the anomaly, and whatever it is protecting along with it, and file the entire matter as resolved before the sector governor's patience or the rebellion's propaganda machine can make further use of the delay. The hunting party assembled with the cold, practiced efficiency of an organization built for exactly this purpose. 3 interdicta-pattern shuttles loaded with purged trooper squads, whose armor bore the deep crimson trim that marked them as inquisitorious auxiliaries rather than ordinary Imperial infantry. A full deployment of probe droids programmed with search parameters tuned specifically to the faint, diffuse force signature Vanther's own senses had traced across the sector, and 2 additional Inquisitors summoned from a reserve garrison 3 systems distant, a scarred, taciturn hunter who introduced himself only as Farron, and a younger, sharper-eyed woman named Kessa Vorik, who wore her ambition as openly as her lightsaber hilt, clearly eager to distinguish herself under a superior of Vanther's reputation. "You believe this creature to be force-sensitive, my lord?" Vorik asked as the hunting party shuttles broke atmosphere above the Badlands, the red-veined canyon country sprawling below them in the pale light of the system's twin suns. The reports describe an energy signature unlike anything catalogued. "I believe it is something the Force does not fully recognize as its own and reacts to accordingly," Vanther said, watching the canyon terrain scroll past the viewport with the patient attention of a man who had learned, across 2 decades of hunting, that terrain itself often told a hunter more than any sensor reading. Whether that makes it more or less dangerous than a trained Force user remains to be determined. I would advise caution, regardless. Farron's reserve garrison lost a full Inquisitor to a similar unclassified anomaly 11 years ago in the Mid-Rim. A survivor's account, if either of you care to review the archived report, describes a resistance the Force itself seemed unable to properly counter. Farron's reserve garrison also lost the Inquisitor in question to what the report eventually concluded was simple incompetence, Farron said, the first words he'd offered since boarding, his scarred face utterly without expression. "I would not put too much stock in a single archived cautionary tale, my lord, however evocatively written. Incompetence and genuine unfamiliarity with a threat are not always easily distinguished from the outside, Inquisitor Farron," Vanther said, his tone carrying no rebuke, only the flat correction of a man accustomed to being obeyed rather than argued with. "I intend this hunt to distinguish between them definitively, one way or the other, before this day is finished." The search grid found its first confirmation within 6 hours, a probe droid sensor sweep catching the faint, telltale heat bloom of a settlement built into canyon shadow, specifically to avoid exactly such detection. Its structures cold-shielded with a competence that spoke of long practice rather than amateur improvisation. Vanther studied the droid's transmitted imagery aboard his shuttle with the particular satisfaction of a hunter finally confirming a trail he had, until that moment, been tracking on instinct and inference alone. "There," he said, and something in the single syllable carried more weight than a longer speech might have managed. 18 years of careful concealment, and a single probe droid's sensor sweep unravels it in an afternoon. Whoever has been hiding these children clearly grew complacent, believing the rim's emptiness alone sufficient protection. Orders, my lord? Vorik asked, already reaching for her lightsaber hilt with the eager readiness of a hunter who had waited a long career for exactly this kind of confirmed, high-value target. Full deployment at dawn, Vander said, watching the canyon's cold-shielded structures resolve with greater clarity as the shuttle banked lower for a final confirming pass. I want the canyon's every entrance and exit surrounded before the settlement wakes to discover it. No warning, no opportunity for evacuation. Whatever this white wolf is, whatever power it wields against the odds it has faced so far, I do not intend to grant it the advantage of preparation this time. Below, unseen by the shuttle sensors as it banked away toward its staging position, a boy on a ridge outcropping watched the distant shape of Imperial engines pass across the Badland sky, and felt, with the particular unschooled certainty of a child who had never learned to doubt his own instincts, a cold and absolute conviction settle into his chest. He was already running toward the canyon's heart before the shuttle's engine thrum had fully faded from the wind. His voice raised in warning that carried, thin and urgent, across dwellings built from salvaged hulls and quarried stone, toward a canyon that had, until this single sweep, kept 30 children safe for 18 careful, patient years. The ward Geralt of Rivia had spent 2 months trying not to choose had finally, inevitably, chosen him instead. And it was coming, by his own reckoning once Mirren relayed the boy's breathless warning to him within the hour, considerably sooner than either of them had dared to hope they'd have time to prepare for. Sundown to sunup. That was the whole of the time Mirren's scouts had bought them. A single boy's warning, and a single night to turn a canyon of frightened children into something that might, with luck and enough blood spent carefully, survive Lord Vanther's dawn. Geralt had faced worse odds with less warning. He told himself that repeatedly through the frantic hours that followed. The way a man repeats a prayer he only half believes, because the repetition itself is a kind of armor. He had prepared for sieges before. Kaer Morhen's fall was not a memory he revisited often, but its lessons surfaced now with brutal, useful clarity. The shape of a defense built from too few hands and too little time against an enemy that would not extend mercy to anyone caught unprepared. We can't fight 2 inquisitors and a company of soldiers, Mirren said, standing beside him at the canyon's central gathering space as the last of the daylight bled violet across the red stone walls. Her voice pitched low enough that the nearest children, herding younger ones toward the shelter dug beneath the settlement's largest structure, would not overhear the particular flavor of her fear. Not with 30 children to protect, not with the resources we have on hand. We're not going to fight them here, Geralt said, already moving, already cataloging the canyon's terrain with the same ruthless practicality he'd applied to it 3 days earlier when Mirren first walked him through every path in and out. We're going to make sure this canyon costs them more than they're willing to spend, buy the children time to run, and hope that's enough to matter. It was not, he knew even as he said it, an honest promise of survival. It was the only promise available to them, and he had learned long ago that a Witcher's contracts rarely came with better guarantees than that. He set the children to work first, not the youngest, whom Mirren gathered into the deepest shelter with the settlement's 2 eldest teenagers to mind them, but those old enough to run message and carry supply, forming a chain of quiet, purposeful motion that reminded Geralt, with an ache he didn't examine too closely, of watching Ciri once organize Kaer Morhen's evacuation drills with the same fierce, focused competence years before either of them understood how badly those drills would eventually matter. His own preparations began with what little alchemical stock remained in the satchel he'd carried through the rift, dwindling now after weeks without proper resupply. Most of his oils exhausted on contracts that had nothing to do with the war this galaxy kept trying to draft him into. But a Witcher learned to make do, and Mirren's 18 years in this canyon had left her with an intimate, hard-won knowledge of every plant and mineral the Badlands offered. Knowledge she now poured into helping him substitute local ingredients for the ones he lacked. This, she said, crushing a handful of pale, waxy leaves between her fingers and offering the bruised remains for his inspection, grows along the canyon's shaded seams. The settlers call it hushbloom. Herbivores avoid it. Something in the sap disrupts their sense of balance, for hours if ingested. Geralt turned the leaves over, testing their scent, their oiliness, the particular resistance of the fiber beneath his thumbnail. Instincts honed across decades of alchemical improvisation reasserting themselves with welcome familiarity. Disorientation agent. Could work into a variant of grape shot if I can find something to bind the volatility. He glanced up. What burns fast and hot out here? Something with resin, ideally. The scrub along the ridge line. Half the canyon's cook fires run on it. Mirren was already moving toward a storage alcove carved into the settlement's rock wall, returning moments later with a dense bundle of dried, resinous brush that Geralt accepted with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman finding unexpected materials fit for purpose. You're building bombs. I'm building problems for anyone who tries to walk into this canyon in tight formation, Geralt said, already working, hands moving through the old, practiced motions of decades, grinding, binding, measuring by instinct rather than precise instrument, the alchemist's certainty that came from having done this exact work 10,000 times before in 100 different conditions. Your children know this ground better than any purge trooper will. I intend to make sure that advantage counts for something more than just knowing where to hide. They worked through the deepening night by lantern light and the glow of the canyon's twin moons, Mirren's knowledge of local flora meeting Gerald's decades of alchemical craft in a partnership that surprised them both with its efficiency. Improvised variants of grape shot rigged from resin and hush bloom sap. Crude but functional analogs to the blister agent oils he'd once brewed from Arenaria and wolfsbane. Tripwire triggers fashioned from salvage transport cabling strung low across the canyon's narrower approach paths. It was not the arsenal of a proper siege. It was the arsenal of a man who had spent a lifetime turning scarcity into just barely enough, and Geralt found, working alongside a woman who understood loss and preparation with equal fluency, something almost like the old rhythm of Caer Morhen returning to his hands. Tamsin found him near midnight, crouched over a half-finished trap at the canyon's eastern approach, her small shape emerging from the dark with the same unnerving quiet the other children carried, though Geralt had begun to suspect hers ran deeper than mere training. "Mirren says I should be asleep," she said, settling onto a nearby rock without waiting for permission, watching his hands work with open, unguarded fascination. "I told her sleep wasn't going to happen tonight regardless of what she said about it." "She's not wrong to want you rested," Geralt said, not looking up from the trigger mechanism he was calibrating. "Whatever's coming tomorrow, you'll want whatever strength you can carry into it." "Is that what you'd have said?" "Before. Different stars, like you told me." She asked it with a particular bluntness children reserved for questions adults usually avoided, and Geralt found himself, not for the first time since arriving in this canyon, unable to summon the deflection he might have offered a stranger. "I'd have said exactly that to someone I cared about the night before something terrible was coming for both of us," he said. "And I'd have been right to say it, and it wouldn't have mattered, because sleep doesn't come easy the night before a fight that might cost you everything. I know that better than most." Tamsin was quiet for a moment, watching the trap take shape beneath his hands. Mirren scared. "She doesn't say it, but I can feel it. It's like a smell, almost, when someone's that afraid and trying not to show it." Her small face tightened, some private calculation working behind her eyes. "I could help. Tomorrow. I know I'm not supposed to. Mirren says I don't have control yet. Says using too much of what I've got could hurt someone, could hurt me. But I could still help." Geralt set down the trigger mechanism and looked at her properly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something he recognized with sudden, aching clarity. The exact shape of a conversation he'd once had with a fierce, frightened girl of roughly this same age, in a fortress under siege in another world entirely, when she had offered him the same reckless, desperate courage and he had needed, with everything in him, to find the right words to both honor that courage and refuse the cost. It demanded, "Tamsin," he said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply, hearing the gravity in it before he'd finished the thought. "I've known someone like you before. Different world, different power. Same fierce need to matter when the people she loved were frightened. She wanted to fight before she was ready to. Every single time, someone older and wiser than either of us had to tell her the same hard truth I'm about to tell you now." "What truth?" "That there will be a right day for you to stand in a fight and matter more than anyone else standing beside you. Tomorrow isn't that day. Tomorrow, your job is to be fast and quiet and exactly where Mirren tells you to be, so that the rest of us can spend everything we got making sure you live long enough to have that right day eventually. He held her gaze, steady, refusing to soften the truth into something easier to swallow. That's not because what you've got doesn't matter. It's because it matters too much to spend carelessly on a night when careful hands can manage without it. Tamsin's jaw tightened, the particular mutinous set of a child who understood the logic and resented it anyway. But after a long moment, she nodded, not agreement exactly, but something adjacent to it, the grudging acceptance of a truth she'd hoped, and failed, to argue her way around. The girl you knew. Different world. Did she listen when someone told her that? Geralt thought of Ciri at Caer Morhen, of 100 moments across 100 years where her stubbornness had won out over caution and her fierce, reckless courage had both saved lives and cost them in equal measure, and found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, uncertain how honestly to answer a child's simple question. Sometimes, he said finally, and sometimes she didn't, and it cost her, and it cost the people who loved her even more. I'm hoping you'll be wiser than she was, at your age. I have a feeling you might manage it. Tamsin considered that with the same solemn weight she brought to everything, and then, unexpectedly, offered him a small, fierce smile that carried more of Ciri in it than Geralt was entirely prepared for. I'll be careful tomorrow, she said. But only tomorrow. After that, I'm done being told to wait. After tomorrow, Geralt said, feeling something in his chest ache in a way alchemy had no remedy for. We'll talk about what comes after. She left him to his work as the first pale hint of dawn began to bleed along the canyon's eastern ridge, and Geralt returned to his traps with renewed, grim urgency, hands moving through the last of his preparations while somewhere above the Badlands, unseen but growing steadily closer, 3 Imperial shuttles carried Lord Vandher and his hunting party toward a canyon that had, by morning's cold and unforgiving light, run entirely out of time to prepare any further. He finished the last trigger as the sky began to lighten, straightened with joints that ached from a night without rest, and looked out across a canyon full of children whose only crime was existing with a gift the galaxy had decided to murder rather than understand, and felt, settling into his bones with the particular weary certainty of a man who had made this same silent vow 100 times across 100 different battlefields, that whatever this day cost him, he intended to make Lord Vandher pay considerably more for the privilege of collecting it. Dawn came to the canyon the way it always did in this galaxy, fast, merciless, twin suns breaking the ridgeline almost without warning, as though the sky itself had no patience for the slow, gentle grays Geralt remembered from mornings on the continent. He stood at the canyon's narrow eastern mouth, silver in one hand, steel at his hip, and watched the light spill down the red-veined stone and thought, with a particular grim clarity that always found him in the last quiet minutes before violence, that he had never once in his long life gotten used to how ordinary the world insisted on looking right before it ended for someone. Mirren found him there, her own blade, a slim, unpowered vibroknife that looked almost apologetic next to the weapon Geralt carried, sheathed at her side, her weathered face set into the particular stillness of a soldier who had made her peace with the shape of the day before it arrived. The children are moving, she said. Denna and Sael have the youngest ones on the eastern path already. Rook's leading the rest toward the ridge tunnel the moment the first shuttle sets down. How long to clear the canyon? An hour if nothing goes wrong. Less if I lend what strength I can to speed them along. Something tightened at the corner of her mouth, which means less strength for anything else when the time comes to need it. Then we make sure they have the hour, Geralt said, and did not say the rest of the thought sitting cold and unspoken behind his ribs, that an hour against 3 interdicta shuttles, a company of purged troopers, and 3 inquisitors was not a promise either of them could honestly make, only a debt they intended to pay regardless of the cost written on the far side of the ledger. The shuttles came in low and fast, exactly as Vandher had ordered, dropping through the pale morning sky in a formation built for encirclement rather than assault, one at the canyon's eastern mouth, one at the western ridge, one hovering high above the basin's heart where its censer suite could paint the whole battlefield for whoever commanded from within. Purged troopers spilled from their loading ramps in disciplined rows, crimson-trimmed armor catching the first light, blaster rifles sweeping the canyon's terraces with the cold efficiency of men who had done this exact work in 100 other hidden places and expected this one to end no differently. They found the tripwires first. Geralt heard the eastern approach erupt into chaos before he saw it. The sharp crack of triggered cabling, the hiss and bloom of hush bloom vapor released into the narrow defile Mirren had shown him 3 nights before, and then the confused, disoriented shouting of soldiers whose inner ears had suddenly, violently, stopped agreeing with their eyes. A dozen troopers stumbled into one another, weapons discharging wild into rock and dust, and Geralt allowed himself one grim flicker of satisfaction before the second wave found its footing and pressed on regardless. Trained discipline reasserting itself even through the fog of alchemy that had no name in this galaxy's arsenal. Kessa Vorik came through the eastern defile at a dead run, ahead of her own troopers, lightsaber already blazing violet in the thin canyon light, clearly unwilling to let a farmer's trick slow a career she'd built on being first through every door. Geralt watched her come with the particular patience he reserved for opponents whose ambition outran their caution, and let the second trap do what he'd built it to do. The tripline caught her ankle exactly where he'd strung it, low and nearly invisible against the canyon's rust-colored dust, and the charge above it, resin and hush blooms sap-bound tight around a length of scavenged conduit, detonated in a gout of flame and choking vapor that swallowed her mid-stride. She staggered from the blast half-blind, coughing, lightsaber swinging wide and undisciplined, and Geralt closed the distance before she'd fully recovered her footing, silver already rising. She saw him at the last instant, some trained reflex cutting through the disorientation enough to bring her blade up in a desperate parry, and for one heartbeat their weapons met in a shower of sparks and violet light. But Geralt had killed things faster than her, meaner than her, more practiced in the specific art of ending a life than her ambition had yet had time to teach her, and when his silver found the gap beneath her guard, she went down without a sound, the violet blade winking out as it fell from fingers that no longer answered. He did not linger over her. There was no room, this morning, for the particular hollow weight that had followed him after the first Inquisitor's death on Ray's Flats. This one had chosen her ending the moment she ran ahead of her own soldiers into a canyon full of children, eager to be the one who found the anomaly the Empire had sent 3 Inquisitors to hunt. He turned from her body toward the sound of heavier fighting already rising from the canyon's heart, and ran. Farron proved a different animal entirely, scarred patient, moving through the canyon's traps with the unhurried care of a hunter who had survived exactly this kind of ambush before and had no intention of repeating whatever mistake had left the scars on his face in the first place. He disarmed 2 tripwires Gerald had spent half the night rigging, simply by walking wide of every choke point that looked too convenient, and reached the canyon's central gathering space with most of his squad still intact behind him, lightsaber humming a low, businesslike red. "White Wolf," he said, when Geralt came to meet him across the abandoned dwellings, voice carrying none of Vorik's eager cruelty, only the flat professional weight of a man doing a job he had done 100 times without particular enjoyment or regret. "Lord Van Ther will want you alive, if it can be managed. I would prefer it that way myself." Fewer questions from command about how a single anomaly cost the Inquisitorius 3 trained hunters in one morning. "Then walk away," Geralt said. "I've got no interest in adding a 4th. "You misunderstand me," Farron said, settling into a low, economical stance that told Geralt more about the man's training than any words could have. "I said I would prefer it, not that I intend to allow it." He came fast for a man his age, faster than Geralt had expected from the deliberate, unhurried way he'd crossed the canyon floor, and the fight that followed had none of the wild, grief-fueled chaos of the first Inquisitor's death weeks before. Farron fought like a craftsman, economical, patient, testing Geralt's reach and speed with careful, probing strikes before committing to anything larger, reading the specific weaknesses of an opponent whose weapons and reflexes he'd clearly studied from whatever reports had reached Vanther's flagship. Geralt met him blade for blade, silver ringing against crimson light, and felt, for the first time since falling into this galaxy, the particular respect a fighter reserves for an opponent who might genuinely kill him if he made even one careless mistake. He used Erden when the opening finally came, the sign flaring to life beneath Farron's boots in a pale, shimmering ring that Geralt had learned, through weeks of trial and costly error, still worked on this world's ground the way it worked on his own, slowing whatever crossed its boundary as though the air itself had thickened to something closer to water. Farron's next strike came a fraction of a heartbeat too slow, the trap's drag dulling reflexes honed across decades, and Geralt Silver found the gap the same way it had found Voryx, though this ending came harder one. Both men breathing raggedly by the time it was finished, Farron's last words a soft, almost thoughtful curse aimed at whatever superior officer had assigned him to a hunt he'd apparently suspected. On some level, he might not survive. Geralt straightened over the body, chest heaving, a fresh burn scoring his forearm where Farron's blade had grazed too close, and heard, from the direction of the canyon's tunnel path, a sound that stopped every other thought in his skull cold. Mirren was screaming. He ran, silver still bare in his hand, following the sound past burning brush and scattered troopers already falling back from the traps, still claiming them one by one, toward the narrow defile where the eldest teenagers had been leading the last of the children toward the ridge tunnel, and found Lord Vandher standing at the tunnel's mouth, robes dark against the smoke-hazed morning, one hand extended toward Mirren, where she knelt in the dust, blood at her lips, some invisible pressure, crushing down on her with the patient, merciless weight of a man who had decided, with the particular efficiency the Force lent to those who mastered its darker currents, that this obstacle would end here. You held your strength in reserve for the children, Vandher said, not raising his voice, the words carrying with terrible clarity across the narrow defile regardless. Admirable. Also, I'm afraid, the precise miscalculation I was counting on. Mirren's eyes found Geralt across the smoke, and in them he read something he recognized with the particular, aching clarity of a man who had seen exactly this look before on exactly this kind of battlefield, on faces he had failed to save in time. She was not afraid for herself. She had spent whatever fear she carried on the children already fled up the tunnel behind her, and what remained in her gaze now was only a fierce, desperate hope that he would understand what came next without her needing to say it. She gathered what strength Vanther's grip hadn't yet crushed from her and threw it, not at the Inquisitor, but past him, into the tunnel's collapsing ceiling, bringing down a curtain of rock and dust between the fleeing children and the battlefield behind them in a final, shuddering exhalation of force that emptied her utterly. Vanther's grip clenched tighter in answer, punishing the defiance, and Mirren Vey went still in the dust without another sound. Geralt reached her a heartbeat too late to matter, and a heartbeat too soon to simply walk past the grief already closing around his chest like a fist, and turned instead, silver rising, toward the man responsible. You've cost me 3 hunters and an entire morning schedule, Vandher said, studying him with the flat, clinical attention of a scholar cataloging a specimen that had finally grown interesting enough to warrant his full focus. I confess, White Wolf, whatever that word actually means, I had begun to suspect the reports of your capability were provincial exaggeration. I no longer suspect that. You're welcome to walk away from what's left of this, Geralt said, voice rough with smoke and grief both. I'll even let you keep the shuttles. I have hunted 17 years for the Empire, and buried every soft impulse that might have once tempted me toward mercy somewhere along that road, Vandher said, and drew the black hilt at his belt, twin crimson blades snapping to life with a hiss that split the smoke-thick air. I do not intend to discover, at this late stage, that the impulse survived after all. He came fast, faster than either Inquisitor before him, faster than the beast on Ray's Flats, faster than anything Geralt had faced since falling through the rift that had thrown him into this galaxy in the first place, and the duel that followed tested every remaining reserve Geralt carried. Chaos and force colliding in a violence that scorched the dry canyon scrub to smoldering ash with every wild exchange. Quen shattered twice under the weight of chained lightning, each collapse costing more than the last, until Geralt fought the final exchanges with nothing between himself and Vanther's power but silver, steel, and the stubborn, animal refusal to stay down that had carried him through worse odds 100 times before. He was losing. He understood that with a particular cold clarity violence always granted him, watching his own blood mix with ash on the scorched ground, feeling Igni's fire answer his call weaker and weaker with every use, Some fundamental well running dry faster than this galaxy's strange, unfamiliar currents could refill it. Vander pressed the advantage without cruelty, without triumph, only the patient, professional certainty of a hunter closing on prey that had simply run out of ground to retreat across. Geralt's hand found the dead Inquisitor's hilt at his belt, the cold cylindrical weight he'd carried since Ray's Flats without once daring to test it. Some instinct warning him against wielding a power he didn't understand and hadn't earned. He understood, in the space of that single desperate heartbeat, exactly what crossing that particular line would cost him, and reached for it anyway, thumbing whatever mechanism his fingers found by instinct alone. Crimson light bloomed in his offhand, twin now to the blades bearing down on him, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Geralt of Rivia fought with a piece of its darkness held willingly in his grip. The canyon burned around them as the duel found its ending, dry scrub catching from a wild, deflected bolt of lightning, smoke rolling thick across the basin floor. The whole grove that had sheltered 30 children for 18 careful years going up in flame around 2 hunters who had each, in their own galaxy, once believed themselves the righteous instrument of something larger than themselves. Vanther's final strike came high and merciless, and Geralt met it with silver in one hand and stolen fire in the other, driving both weapons home in the same desperate heartbeat, and felt Lord Vanther's cold, patient certainty finally, permanently, go still. He stood over the body for a long moment, breathing smoke and ash, the stolen blade guttering out in his shaking hand, as though even it understood the weight of what he'd just allowed himself to become to end this. Then he turned and ran back toward the collapsed tunnel, toward the grief already waiting for him there, and did not look back at the fire consuming what remained of the grove behind him. The silence that followed the battle was louder than the clash of blades. Geralt stood alone at the edge of the shattered canyon, the cold mountain wind tugging at his torn cloak. Ash drifted through the air like black snow, settling over broken stone and scorched earth. The smell of burned rock lingered, mixed with blood and ozone. The crimson lightsaber was gone. He had let it fall the moment Lord Vanther's body struck the ground. Now only the silver sword remained in his hand. His fingers refused to unclench. Behind him came the cautious footsteps of survivors. Mirren was first. Her left arm hung useless at her side, wrapped in strips of torn cloth stained dark with blood. Her face was pale beneath the soot, yet she carried herself with the same stubborn determination that had first made Geralt respect her. "You can put the sword away," she said quietly. Geralt didn't answer. "You won." "No." His voice sounded hollow. "I survived." There was a difference. He knew it. The Force knew it. He could still feel the echo inside him. The anger, the hatred, the intoxicating certainty that came with drawing on emotions he had spent decades suppressing. For a heartbeat during the duel, he hadn't been Geralt of Rivia. He had become something else, something frighteningly capable, something that had wanted Lord Vanther to suffer before dying. That realization chilled him more than the mountain wind ever could. The children slowly emerged from their hiding places among the rocks. None of them spoke. They stared at Geralt with wide, uncertain eyes. Hours earlier, they had seen him as a protector. Now they had witnessed him unleash power even the Inquisitor had feared. Little Sarah approached first. She couldn't have been older than 8. The tiny girl looked up at him before reaching for his gloved hand. "You came back." Geralt looked down. "I said I would. You were scary. I know. But..." She smiled despite everything. "You were scary to the bad man." The tension around the gathered survivors eased just enough for nervous laughter to ripple through the group. Even Geralt managed the faintest hint of a smile. Children had a remarkable ability to simplify truths adults buried beneath fear. Tamsin emerged from the ruins, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "The archives." Geralt raised an eyebrow. "I managed to save some of them." She knelt carefully, unfolding brittle pages covered with symbols older than the Republic itself. "The Empire came here because of these." Mirren frowned. "They're only stories." "No." Tamsin shook her head. "They're instructions." Geralt crouched beside her. The writing wasn't Orbesh. Neither was it any language he recognized from decades wandering countless worlds. Yet something about the symbols stirred faint memories. Ancient temples, forgotten ruins, whispers carried through places saturated with the Force. What do they say? Tamsin hesitated. They describe a place. What place? A sanctuary. The word hung heavily between them. A refuge built long before the Jedi Order existed. Mirren crossed her arms. You expect us to believe there are hidden Jedi cities no one's found? Not Jedi. Tamsin looked toward the distant horizon. Older. Geralt's yellow eyes narrowed. Older than the Jedi. There were very few things in the galaxy that fit that description. None of them were comforting. By sunset, they buried the dead. No speeches. No ceremonies. Just stones stacked carefully beneath the open sky. Geralt helped dig every grave. Each shovel of earth felt heavier than the last. He remembered names, faces, children who had laughed only yesterday, guardians who had chosen to stand despite knowing they could never defeat an Imperial Inquisitor. Their courage deserved remembrance. When the final grave was covered, Mirren placed Vanther's broken mask atop the largest cairn. A warning, she said. Geralt looked at it for a long moment. No. He walked forward, picked up the shattered mask, then carried it to the canyon's edge. Without a word, he threw it into the abyss. The wind swallowed it. No monuments for monsters. That night no one slept well. The campfires burned low. Several children woke, screaming from nightmares. Geralt remained awake beside the perimeter, sharpening his silver sword by habit more than necessity. The rhythmic scrape of whetstone against steel calmed his thoughts. Or tried to. The darkness within refused to fade. He remembered the moment he had ignited the crimson blade. How effortless it had felt. How right. That frightened him. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. You've held cursed sword before. Geralt glanced sideways. Tamsin lowered herself beside him. Not like that. No. She nodded. Nothing is. She studied him carefully. You think using it changed you. It almost did. But it didn't. I wanted revenge. You wanted children to live. I enjoyed hurting him. Silence. Finally Tamsin spoke. The Force doesn't judge moments. Geralt looked at her skeptically. It judges choices. You sound like a Jedi. She smiled sadly. I sound like someone who survived them. Morning arrived beneath heavy clouds. The mountain pass leading away from the sanctuary lay buried beneath fallen stone from the battle. Mirren surveyed the blockage. We'll never move all this. Geralt stepped closer. Not by hand. The survivors exchanged uncertain looks. Then one of the older boys lifted a small rock. It floated. Another child added her concentration. More stones rose. Soon nearly a dozen children worked together. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but together. Massive boulders shifted inch by inch. Geralt watched in silence. None of them had formal Jedi training. No temples. No masters. Only instinct, hope, and each other. Perhaps that had always been enough. By midday the path was clear. The question remained. Where would they go? Staying meant certain death. The Empire would send another Inquisitor. Perhaps several. Running blindly offered little better odds. Tamsin carefully rolled the surviving scrolls. I know where the sanctuary is. Everyone looked toward her. I've spent 30 years translating these texts. And I know the route. Mirren frowned. Why didn't you say something before? Because I wasn't sure it still existed. She looked directly at Geralt. After today, she paused. I think the Force kept it hidden until someone worthy arrived. Geralt sighed. Don't start making legends out of me. I'm not. She smiled faintly. I'm talking about them. The children, not Geralt. For the first time since the battle, he allowed himself to believe there might be a future beyond survival. A place where they wouldn't have to hide. A place where children could discover what they were without fear of the Empire. It sounded impossible, which was exactly why it was worth chasing. Geralt tightened the straps on his armor. Then we move. No one argued. The survivors formed a long line along the mountain trail. Children in the center. fighters on the outside. Geralt walked at the front, silver sword across his back, senses alert for danger. Behind him stretched the last fragile hope of a forgotten people. Ahead lay a road no Witcher had ever walked. And somewhere beyond the endless peaks waited a sanctuary that had remained hidden since before the rise of the Jedi. Geralt had no idea whether it truly existed, but after everything he had witnessed, he had learned not to dismiss impossible things too quickly. The path, it seemed, was not finished with him yet. For 3 days, the mountains tested them. The trail Tamsin followed could scarcely be called a path. It wound through jagged ridges where ancient landslides had buried old routes beneath fields of broken stone. Narrow ledges overlooked valleys that disappeared into clouds, and icy winds howled between the cliffs, with a voice that reminded Geralt of monsters he had hunted in another world. This world had different monsters: stormtrooper patrols, probe droids, Imperial shuttles. Fear. Geralt preferred the first 3. Fear lingered long after an enemy was gone. Each evening, he walked the perimeter while the others slept. His Witcher senses searched for danger, but it was his own thoughts that pursued him most relentlessly. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw crimson, not blood, the lightsaber, the impossible weapon that had answered his hand. He remembered how effortlessly it had cut through armor, how naturally it had obeyed him, how satisfying it had felt. That last memory disturbed him more than the others. A Witcher accepted killing when it was necessary. He had never accepted enjoying it. The 4th morning began with laughter. Geralt frowned. That alone made him suspicious. Children should have been exhausted after the climb, yet several of them were gathered around one of the younger boys. "What's happening?" Mirren smiled. "Kale." The boy blushed. I made it happen." Geralt watched as a wooden cup lifted from the ground, floated uncertainly through the air, and landed directly into another child's waiting hands. The children erupted into applause. The cup immediately tipped over. Water splashed across everyone's boots. Laughter echoed through the mountain pass. Geralt found himself smiling despite everything. The Force had nearly destroyed them only days ago. Now it was helping children pass a drinking cup. Perhaps power became dangerous only when adults insisted on making it so. That afternoon, danger returned. Geralt froze without warning. His medallion, though useless in this galaxy for detecting magic, had begun vibrating ever so slightly. Not because of sorcery, because something massive disturbed the ground. "Down," he said quietly. Everyone obeyed instantly. A shadow passed overhead, not an Imperial shuttle. Larger, far quieter. Its dark hull glided between the clouds before vanishing behind the peaks. Mirren whispered, "Star Destroyer?" Geralt shook his head. "No." Tamsin's face lost all color. "I know that silhouette." "What is it?" "An Inquisitor transport." Silence fell. Geralt looked back toward the canyon they had left behind. "They're already searching. The Empire won't stop after losing Vandher." "No. They'll assume others helped him. They'll assume correctly." One of the children looked up nervously. "Will they find us?" Geralt rested a hand on the child's shoulder. Not today. But he wasn't certain. They altered their route immediately. Instead of following the ridgeline, Tamsin led them into an immense cavern hidden behind a frozen waterfall. Inside, crystal formations stretched toward the ceiling like forests of glass. Every sound echoed for what seemed like forever. The children stared in amazement. One reached toward a crystal. The moment her fingers touched it, the cavern began to sing. Soft, beautiful. Thousands of shimmering notes filled the darkness. Every crystal vibrated together, creating music unlike anything Geralt had ever heard. Even the air seemed alive. Tamsin closed her eyes. I wondered if this place still remembered. Remembered what? The people who built it. Geralt looked around carefully. There were no carvings, no statues, no signs of civilization. Then he noticed the walls. Perfectly smooth. Far too smooth for nature. This wasn't a cave. Tamsin nodded. It was a doorway. As they ventured deeper, the music changed. Lower, slower, almost mournful. Gerald's instincts sharpened. Something was watching. He couldn't hear footsteps, couldn't smell another living creature. Yet the sensation refused to leave. Mirren noticed. You feel it too? He nodded. It isn't hostile. How can you tell? Because if it were. He glanced into the darkness. We'd already be dead. The answer did little to comfort anyone. Hours later, they reached an enormous chamber. The ceiling disappeared into darkness hundreds of meters overhead. Ancient pillars circled a wide stone platform at its center. Every surface was covered with symbols matching those preserved in Tamsin scrolls. The old scholar walked forward in complete silence. Her hands trembled. I translated these words for decades. She gently touched one of the carvings. I never believed I would actually stand here. What does it say? She read aloud. Asterisk, knowledge without compassion becomes tyranny. Asterisk, another pillar. Asterisk, power without restraint becomes ruin. Asterisk, another. Asterisk, the force belongs to no order, no empire, and no throne. Asterisk. Geralt stood quietly. Those words carried a wisdom older than politics, older than Jedi, older than Sith, perhaps older than history itself. The chamber suddenly trembled. Dust drifted from above. The children instinctively gathered together. A low mechanical hum echoed somewhere beyond the darkness. Geralt drew his silver sword. Mirren raised her blaster. The sound grew louder. Then a pale blue light appeared between the pillars. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. A figure formed slowly from shimmering energy. An elderly woman. Transparent. Calm. She regarded the gathered refugees with gentle eyes. Nobody moved. Even the children fell completely silent. The apparition looked first at Tamsin. You kept the word alive. Tears rolled down the old woman's face. I tried. Then the figure turned toward Geralt. And you? Geralt tightened his grip. Do not belong. No, I don't. The ghost smiled. Neither did the first guardian. Geralt blinked. What? You crossed worlds. His expression hardened. What do you know about that? The apparition stepped closer. The Force touches many realities. Her glowing gaze settled on him with quiet certainty. Some souls are carried where they are needed most. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Geralt had no answer. He had spent years asking why. Why he had been torn from his own world. Why destiny refused to leave him alone. Now, standing beneath an ancient sanctuary forgotten by history itself, someone finally offered an answer. Not because he was chosen. Not because he was special. Because he had been needed. It wasn't comforting. It was simply enough. The spirit turned toward the children. The sanctuary accepts those who seek life over dominion. The floor beneath them began to glow. Ancient symbols illuminated one after another, spreading through the chamber like flowing rivers of starlight. Deep within the mountain, something vast awakened. Geralt instinctively stepped in front of the children. The spirit only smiled. There is no need for your sword here, White Wolf. The title caught him off guard. He had not heard it since another world, another lifetime. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Geralt lowered his blade. For the first time since arriving in the Empire, he allowed himself to believe they might finally have reached a place beyond the Emperor's reach. He hoped he was right, because if the Empire had followed them into these ancient mountains, the final battle was still waiting. The light spread across the chamber until every carved line glowed with a soft silver radiance. The mountain itself seemed to breathe. Ancient mechanisms, silent for thousands of years, awakened beneath their feet. Stone ground against stone with a deep, resonant rumble that echoed through the cavern. The children instinctively stepped closer together. No one spoke. The transparent woman simply watched. Stand in the center, she said. Tamsin obeyed first. The others followed cautiously until they stood upon the circular platform. Geralt remained at the edge. The spirit tilted her head. You hesitate. I've learned to. A useful habit. Her smile carried neither amusement nor criticism, but unnecessary here. Geralt slowly stepped onto the platform. The instant his boots touched the engraved stone, a pulse of energy raced outward. The symbols surrounding them flared brilliantly. Then the chamber changed. The walls dissolved. Not physically. The stone remained beneath his hands. Yet Geralt no longer saw the cavern. Instead, stars stretched endlessly around them. Galaxies drifted like islands across an infinite sea of darkness. The children gasped. Mirren reached for her blaster before realizing there was nothing to aim at. "We're not moving," Tamsin whispered. "No," the spirit replied. "You are remembering." One by one, figures appeared among the stars. Not ghosts, memories. Men and women dressed in robes unlike those of the Jedi. Some carried no weapons at all. Others held staffs carved from crystal and wood. Children trained beside elders beneath enormous trees whose branches shimmered with light. Communities flourished without temples or armies. They were called the Keepers, the Spirit explained. They existed before the Jedi Order gave structure to the Force. "What happened to them?" Mirren asked quietly. "They believed the Force should never belong to rulers." The vision shifted. Cities burned. Warships filled the sky. People fled through forests carrying children in their arms. They refused to become soldiers. Another image. Those same people sealed great stone doors. Entire sanctuaries vanished beneath mountains, deserts, and oceans. They chose hiding over conquest. The stars faded. The cavern returned. Geralt stood motionless. "So this place is one of the last." The spirit nodded. "Not a fortress. A refuge." A sudden vibration interrupted the silence. This time it came from Geralt's belt. The stolen Imperial comlink. He frowned. It had been dead since Vanther's defeat. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then a voice. "Respond, survivor beacon detected." Another burst of interference. Multiple life signs confirmed. Geralt's expression hardened. "They found us." The spirit looked toward the ceiling. They followed the beacon carried by the Inquisitor. Mirren cursed under her breath. The armor. Geralt understood immediately. When Vanther had fallen, none of them had searched the body thoroughly. Some emergency transmitter must have activated automatically. How long? The spirit closed her glowing eyes. "They are already within the mountain." The chamber fell silent. One of the younger children began to cry. Geralt knelt beside him. "Listen to me." The boy wiped his eyes. "Remember what I told you?" The child nodded uncertainly. "What do monsters want?" "They want us to be afraid." "And what do we do?" The answer came stronger this time. "We don't make it easy." Geralt smiled. "Good." He stood, then looked toward Mirren. "Take everyone deeper into the sanctuary." She frowned. "What about you?" "I'll slow them down." "No." Her answer came instantly. "We're not doing that again." "You have children to protect." "So do you." "I can buy time." "And die." Geralt didn't respond. Because she was right. The spirit interrupted them. "There is another way." Everyone turned. She pointed toward the far wall. The solid stone rippled like water. A hidden passage emerged. "It leads to the heart chamber." Tamsin's eyes widened. The texts mentioned it. "What is it?" "The sanctuary's living memory." The spirit nodded. "If the children reach it." She paused. "This place will awaken completely. And then, the mountain will defend itself." Geralt raised an eyebrow. Against an Imperial company? Against anyone who seeks domination? He had learned not to dismiss impossible statements. Not anymore. Blaster fire echoed through distant tunnels. Sharp. Close. Stormtroopers. The Empire had arrived. Geralt unsheathed his silver sword. The familiar weight steadied him. No crimson blade. No borrowed power. Just steel. Just skill. Just the man he had always been. He looked toward the frightened children. "You know the plan." Sarah nodded bravely. "We keep moving." "Exactly." She smiled. "And you catch up." "I'll try." The little girl hugged him before he could protest. One by one, the others followed. Some embraced him. Some simply nodded. Others whispered quiet thanks. Geralt accepted each gesture awkwardly. He had never been comfortable with gratitude. The refugees disappeared into the hidden passage. Mirren lingered. You'd better survive. I've been trying to. She laughed despite herself. Then her expression softened. You know, she hesitated. When I first met you, I thought you were just another mercenary. I've been called worse. I know. She looked directly into his amber eyes. You're something much rarer. Before Geralt could answer, she turned and vanished into the tunnel. The stone walls sealed behind her, leaving Geralt alone. Almost. The spirit remained. You carry many worlds upon your shoulders. So I've been told. You cannot save everyone. I know, but you'll try anyway. He sighed. Probably. She smiled. Then perhaps destiny chose well. The first stormtroopers emerged from the darkness seconds later. White armor. 11 blasters raised. There. Red bolts filled the chamber. Geralt moved. The first shot struck empty air. The second scorched the stone where he had stood an instant earlier. He closed the distance before the third could fire. His silver blade flashed. The leading trooper collapsed. Geralt seized the fallen blaster in his left hand. He disliked firearms. Today was not a day for preferences. He fired twice. 2 more soldiers fell. The remaining squad scattered behind pillars. Target confirmed. One shouted into his helmet. The Witcher is here. Geralt allowed himself a grim smile. Good. Let them think he was alone. Every minute they spent chasing him was another minute for the children. Another minute for hope. From deeper within the sanctuary came a low, powerful hum. The mountain was awakening. Geralt tightened his grip on his sword. Come on, he muttered to the advancing troops. I'm right here. The echoes of marching boots multiplied through the tunnels. One squad. Then another. Then another. An entire Imperial detachment poured into the ancient sanctuary. Geralt planted his feet between them and the hidden passage. Once again, the path had brought him to the same choice it always had. Stand, or step aside. He had never been particularly good at stepping aside. The first wave broke against him like water striking stone. Blaster bolts scorched the ancient chamber, filling the air with flashes of red light and showers of molten rock. Geralt moved through them with the same economy that had carried him through a lifetime of impossible hunts. Every step had purpose. Every swing conserved strength. There was no wasted motion. His silver sword split the barrel of one trooper's rifle before continuing into the plastoid armor beneath. Another fired from behind a pillar. Geralt snatched the fallen 11 blaster from the ground and fired a single shot without looking. The bolt struck the trooper squarely in the chest. He discarded the weapon immediately. Steel felt more honest, more reliable. The Imperials hesitated. Their training had prepared them for Jedi, not for a swordsman who neither used a lightsaber nor fell to concentrated blaster fire. Circle him, an officer shouted. Keep your distance. They obeyed. Geralt almost smiled. Distance favored rifles. Close quarters favored Witchers. He rushed the nearest squad before they could complete the maneuver. Deeper within the sanctuary, Mirren heard the battle. Each clash echoed faintly through the stone corridors. The children heard it too. No one needed to ask who was buying them time. Sarah clutched Mirren's hand. He's alone. Mirren swallowed. For now. Shouldn't we help? We help by reaching the heart chamber. It sounded cruel, cowardly. Everything inside her screamed to turn back. But she remembered Geralt's expression. Not fear. Acceptance. He had chosen his place. Now she had to honor it. The hidden passage widened into a vast underground valley. None of them had expected the mountain to contain an entire world. Trees with silver leaves stretched toward a ceiling of glowing crystal. Streams flowed with impossibly clear water. Strange birds glided silently through the cavern, their feathers shimmering with pale blue light. The children stared in wonder. One whispered, "It's alive." Tamsin nodded slowly. The sanctuary isn't just ruins. It's an ecosystem. Plants untouched by Imperial industry flourished in every direction. Creatures unafraid of people wandered openly between the trees. No machines. No smoke. No scars left by war. For the first time in decades, the force felt peaceful, not absent, balanced. At the center of the valley stood a single enormous tree. Its trunk was wider than a starship. Its roots disappeared deep into the stone below. Its branches reached nearly to the crystal ceiling, each leaf glowing softly like captured starlight. Every child stopped walking simultaneously, not because anyone told them to, because they all felt it. The force flowed from the tree like warmth from a fire. Tamsin's voice trembled. The heart. Meanwhile, the battle intensified. Geralt ducked beneath another volley of blaster fire. A thermal detonator rolled across the floor. He kicked it back instinctively. The explosion hurled 3 stormtroopers into a nearby wall. Smoke filled the chamber. Through it emerged black armor. Not stormtroopers. Purge troopers. Elite soldiers trained specifically to hunt Jedi. Each carried an electro staff crackling with blue energy. Geralt recognized professionals immediately. They spread into formation without speaking. One attacked high, another low. A third waited for an opening. Good tactics. He had seen similar coordination among experienced Witcher schools. Unfortunately for them, Geralt had survived fighting Witchers. Steel met energized metal. The impact rattled his arms. The Purge trooper pressed forward with mechanical precision. Geralt twisted aside, letting momentum carry the staff harmlessly past him before driving his elbow into the soldier's helmet. The visor cracked. A quick thrust ended the fight. The second attacker was already there. No hesitation, no emotion, only relentless discipline. Geralt respected that. He defeated him anyway. The remaining Imperials regrouped. Their commander stepped forward. Unlike the others, he wore gray officer's armor beneath a heavy command cloak. His face was scarred. One cybernetic eye focused directly on Geralt. So, his voice echoed through the chamber. The reports were accurate. Geralt remained silent. A mutant. I've been called that before. I'm Commander Rax. I didn't ask. The officer smiled faintly. You killed an Inquisitor. He attacked children. You become quite troublesome. Geralt rested the tip of his sword against the stone floor. Usually happens when people hunt children. Rax ignored the remark. The Emperor's curious about you. I'm not interested. You don't have a choice. I usually do. The commander sighed. I hoped this could remain civil. Geralt raised an eyebrow. You brought an army. I brought efficiency. He lifted one hand. Every surviving soldier aimed their rifles. Capture him. Back at the heart tree, the children instinctively gathered around the massive trunk. None of them knew what to do. The tree answered first. Its leaves shimmered. Roots slowly emerged from the earth, not threateningly, but gently, winding around the children like protective walls. Sarah looked upward. I think, she whispered, it knows us. Tamsin opened one of the rescued scrolls. The final page contained only a single sentence. She read it aloud. Asterisk, the sanctuary awakens only when the innocent choose one another over themselves. Asterisk. Mirren frowned. What does that mean? No one answered. Then Kale stepped forward. He placed one hand against the ancient bark. I don't want power. Another child joined him. I don't want revenge. Another. I just want everyone safe. One by one, every child touched the tree. The valley brightened. The roots beneath the ground pulsed with golden light. Far above, throughout the entire mountain, ancient systems awakened completely. Stone doors sealed themselves. Hidden passages shifted. Entire corridors vanished. The sanctuary had decided. It would protect its own. Commander Rax heard the mountain move. His cybernetic eye scanned rapidly. What was that? No one answered. The chamber trembled. Several tunnels collapsed without warning. Others opened where solid walls had stood moments before. Stormtroopers shouted in confusion. Sir, our map just changed. Impossible. The scanners can't keep up. Geralt noticed it too. The spirit had spoken the truth. The mountain was fighting, not with weapons, with itself, turning every corridor into a labyrinth, separating Imperial squads from one another. Rax's expression darkened. Find the children. Static answered him. Entire platoons had disappeared behind shifting stone. Communication dissolved into chaos. Geralt took one slow breath, then charged. If the sanctuary intended to delay the Empire, he intended to finish the job. Commander Rax had spent 27 years hunting insurgents, pirates, and Jedi survivors. Nothing in his career resembled what was happening inside the mountain. Entire corridors folded into themselves. Bridges that had existed moments earlier dissolved into solid stone. Passages opened beneath squads only to deposit them hundreds of meters away from their objectives. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't sabotage. It was as if the mountain itself had decided the Empire was no longer welcome. Rax refused to believe in legends. Seal every exit, he barked into his comlink. Forget the labyrinth. Drive him toward this central chamber. A chorus of acknowledgments answered. Unlike Vanther, Rax wasn't driven by pride. He was patient, methodical, dangerous. Geralt recognized the difference immediately. This man wasn't trying to prove himself. He was trying to win. A squad emerged from a newly opened corridor. Geralt met them before they could organize. His sword caught the first rifle beneath its barrel, wrenching it sideways. The blaster discharged into the cavern ceiling, showering sparks across the stone. The second trooper lunged with an electrobaton. Geralt pivoted, trapped the weapon beneath his forearm, and drove his pommel into the soldier's throat. The third managed a clean shot. Pain exploded across Geralt's shoulder. The blaster bolt burned through leather and chain before carving a furrow across his flesh. He staggered, only for a heartbeat. Years of mutagens had taught him to keep moving through pain. Stopping was what killed you. He rushed forward before the troopers realized they had hit him. 3 seconds later, the corridor was silent again. Geralt leaned against a pillar. Blood seeped steadily beneath his armor. He tore away the scorched leather and examined the wound. Bad. Not fatal. Not yet. He wrapped it tightly with a strip of cloth torn from his cloak. It'll hold, he muttered. Whether he believed that or not hardly mattered. There was still work to do. Deep inside the sanctuary, the heart tree continued to awaken. Golden light flowed through every branch. The children stood in a wide circle around it, each resting a hand against the ancient bark. No one had instructed them. The Force simply guided them. Mirren watched in stunned silence. The roots beneath their feet pulsed, like veins carrying light instead of blood. Every pulse spread farther into the mountain. The crystal ceiling brightened until it resembled a sky filled with stars. Tamsin slowly smiled. I understand now. Mirren looked at her. The sanctuary doesn't choose warriors. It chooses caretakers. The children aren't inheriting power. They're inheriting responsibility. Suddenly, every child gasped at once. Visions flooded their minds. Not commands. Memories. They saw families laughing beneath these same branches thousands of years earlier. They saw scholars preserving knowledge instead of weapons. They saw healers treating strangers regardless of where they came from. They saw people refusing to fight wars they could have won because victory purchased with hatred always demanded another war. Then the final vision came. The keepers sealing the sanctuary forever. One elder spoke the last recorded words before the doors closed. Asterisk, if someday children return without seeking dominion, let the sanctuary live again. Asterisk. The vision faded. Several children wiped tears from their eyes without understanding why they were crying. Some memories belonged not to individuals, but to places. Geralt sensed the change immediately. The oppressive weight hanging over the mountain disappeared. For the first time since entering the sanctuary, the Force no longer felt ancient and watchful. It felt hopeful. He almost laughed. He had spent decades distrusting destiny. Yet somehow destiny kept placing children in his path. Ciri. Now these children. Perhaps fate had a strange sense of humor. A sudden explosion interrupted his thoughts. The floor beneath him cracked. Commander Rax stepped through the settling dust. He wasn't alone. 6 purge troopers formed a perfect semicircle around him. Each carried a humming electrostaff. Each visor remained fixed upon Geralt. Rax calmly removed his gloves. "I've reviewed everything we recovered from Lord Vanther's recordings." Geralt said nothing. "You adapt. You survive. You exploit terrain." The commander slowly drew an elegant vibroblade from his belt. "But every hunter has limits." Geralt shifted his footing. "So do commanders." Rax inclined his head. "Let's find yours." He attacked. Unlike Vanther, Rax didn't rely on overwhelming aggression. Every strike tested, measured, calculated. His blade sought openings rather than domination. Geralt parried. Metal screamed against metal. The purged troopers attacked in perfect coordination. One forced Geralt backward. Another cut off his escape. A third aimed precisely for his injured shoulder. Pain flared through his arm. His movements slowed. Only slightly. But Rax noticed. Of course he did. "There." The commander smiled coldly. "Injury changes probability." He pressed harder. Geralt yielded ground step by step. Each retreat intentional. Each step bringing the Imperials farther from the sealed passage. Farther from the children. Exactly where he wanted them. Inside the heart chamber, the tree suddenly shed hundreds of glowing leaves. Instead of falling, they floated into the air. Each leaf became a tiny point of light. The children watched as thousands of them drifted upward, disappearing into cracks in the stone ceiling. Tamsin whispered, "The sanctuary is reaching beyond itself." Mirren frowned. "To do what?" Before anyone answered, the mountain answered for them. Every crystal throughout the sanctuary burst into brilliant light. Outside, far above the peaks, Imperial sensors aboard the orbiting transport suddenly failed. Navigation systems scrambled. Communications dissolved into static. Probe droids fell from the sky like stones. The sanctuary had hidden itself once again, not by disappearing, by becoming invisible to those who sought it with violence. Back in the central chamber, Rax frowned as his helmet crackled. "Commander. Static. Can't locate. All scanners. Nothing." Every signal died. For the first time since entering the mountain, Commander Rax looked uncertain. Geralt saw it. One moment. One mistake. That was all experienced fighters ever needed. He feinted toward the commander. Two purged troopers moved instinctively to protect him. Exactly as Geralt expected. Instead of continuing the attack, he pivoted sharply, using one trooper as a shield against another's electrostaff. Blue energy exploded between them. The stunned soldiers collided. Geralt drove his shoulder into the third. The formation broke. Rax cursed. "Reform." Too late. Geralt had already slipped through the gap. His silver sword flashed once, then twice. Two purged troopers fell. Another dropped his weapon, clutching a ruined arm. The remaining soldiers hesitated. Not out of fear, out of respect. They finally understood. This wasn't a Jedi. This wasn't a soldier. This was a hunter who had spent a lifetime defeating creatures stronger than himself. And he was using every lesson he had ever learned. Commander Rax tightened his grip on his vibroblade. "So this," he said quietly, "is why the Emperor wanted you alive." Geralt's breathing had grown heavier. Blood continued to soak the bandage around his shoulder. His legs ached. His reflexes had begun to slow. He knew his body. He knew he could not keep this pace much longer. But neither could the Empire. Far beneath them, the heart tree pulsed once more. The entire sanctuary trembled. Ancient doors began to close. Massive stone walls shifted into place. The mountain was preparing to seal itself again, and anyone still inside would remain trapped forever. The grinding of stone echoed through every corridor. Massive slabs descended from the ceiling with relentless precision, sealing tunnels that had stood open for millennia. Pillars shifted. Stairways disappeared into solid rock. Entire chambers folded inward like the petals of a closing flower. The sanctuary was preparing to sleep again. Commander Rax looked around sharply. No, his voice carried something Geralt had not heard before. Urgency. He tapped furiously at the controls on his wrist. "This is Commander Rax. Emergency extraction. Respond." Only static answered. The sanctuary had swallowed every Imperial transmission. For the first time in years, the Empire was truly alone. Geralt lowered his stance. His injured shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. His left arm had begun to numb. Fatigue crept into muscles strengthened by Witcher mutations, but not immune to exhaustion. He knew exactly how much he had left. Not much. Enough. It would have to be enough. Rax studied him with cold calculation. You're slowing. Geralt wiped blood from the corner of his mouth. So are you. The commander glanced briefly toward his remaining purge troopers. Only 3 remained standing. Their armor was cracked. One limped noticeably. Another's electrostaff sparked erratically. Victory had become expensive. You don't understand, Rax said. His voice had changed. Less arrogance. More conviction. If those children live, they'll become another Jedi Order. Geralt shook his head. No, you can't know that. I've watched them. They'll become a threat. They're children. They'll grow. So will everyone. Rax's cybernetic eye narrowed. The Emperor brings order. Geralt laughed. A short, tired laugh. I've met men who promised order. He remembered kings, emperors, sorcerers, generals. Every one of them had believed the same thing, that peace could be forced, that fear could become stability. It never lasted. You know what they all had in common? Rax remained silent. They always needed one more war. The commander attacked without warning. His vibroblade struck with brutal speed. Geralt barely caught it. The impact sent pain exploding through his wounded shoulder. His sword nearly slipped from his grasp. The remaining purge troopers moved simultaneously, one from each side. Perfect discipline, perfect timing. Geralt abandoned defense. Instead of blocking, he stepped inside Rax's guard. His forehead slammed into the commander's face. Bone cracked. Rax stumbled backward. Before the purge troopers could adjust, Geralt seized the commander's cloak and threw him directly into their path. Formation dissolved. One soldier instinctively caught his superior. Another lost his footing. That single moment was enough. Geralt's silver sword flashed in a clean horizontal arc. The first purge trooper fell. A second thrust ended another. The last charged with a roar, abandoning discipline for anger. Geralt sidestepped. The electrostaff smashed harmlessly into stone. One precise strike to the exposed neck ended the fight. Silence returned. Only Geralt and Commander Rax remained. Far below, the children felt the battle drawing toward its end. The heart tree shimmered brighter than ever. Its roots extended through the mountain, carrying streams of golden light into every chamber. Sarah opened her eyes. He's hurt. Mirren looked toward her. How do you know? I can feel him. Several other children nodded. So can we. Tamsin looked from one face to another. They're connected. To Geralt? She shook her head gently. To everyone. The sanctuary was teaching them its oldest lesson. The Force was not domination. It was relationship. Every life strengthened another. No one stood alone. Commander Rax rose slowly. Blood ran from a cut above his cybernetic eye. You could have served the Empire. I've never liked taking orders. You would have been feared. I already am. You would have been remembered. Geralt met his gaze. I don't care. That answer unsettled Rax more than any sword strike. Every Imperial officer sought legacy, promotion, recognition, history. This man wanted none of it. He simply wanted innocent people left alone. The commander finally understood why the Emperor considered Geralt dangerous. Not because of his strength, because he could not be tempted. Rax drew a compact thermal charge from his belt. Geralt's eyes narrowed. If I cannot have the sanctuary. The commander armed the device. No one will. The indicator turned red. 8 seconds. Geralt moved instantly. Rax threw the explosive, not at Geralt, toward the sealed passage leading to the heart chamber. If it detonated there, the collapse would bury everyone inside. Geralt didn't think. He reacted. His body launched forward before reason caught up. 7 seconds. He caught the device in midair. 6. Rax smiled. 5. There was no time to throw it far enough. 4. No time to dismantle it. 3. Geralt looked toward the ancient spirit, who had silently watched everything unfold. She met his eyes, then smiled, not sadly, proudly. 2. Geralt hurled the explosive upward into one of the glowing crystal formations, suspended high above the chamber. 1. The charge detonated. The explosion shattered thousands of crystals. Instead of collapsing, they erupted into brilliant light. A wave of force energy cascaded through the chamber like a tidal wave. The blast struck everyone. Geralt was thrown backward. Commander Rax slammed into a pillar. Stone cracked. The mountain roared. Then, everything became still. The sanctuary had answered violence with transformation, not destruction. The shattered crystals dissolved into countless glowing fragments that drifted gently through the air like stars. Every fragment settled into damaged walls, broken pillars, collapsed ceilings. Where they landed, stone healed. Cracks disappeared. The sanctuary repaired itself. Rax stared in disbelief. What? The spirit answered softly. You cannot destroy what was built to preserve life. The final door began to descend. Slowly, immovably, the sanctuary was sealing forever. Commander Rax struggled to stand. He looked once toward the closing entrance, then toward Geralt. You've trapped us both. Geralt picked up his silver sword. No. He looked toward another passage that had quietly opened behind him. A passage that had not existed moments earlier. The mountain made its choice. The commander turned. His expression finally changed from certainty to realization. The sanctuary was allowing one guardian to leave, not two. Geralt understood. So did the spirit. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the mountain peaks. Inside, the ancient refuge prepared to vanish from history once more. Geralt took one last look at Commander Rax. I've spent my life killing monsters. He rested the sword across his shoulder. I finally learned something. Rax said nothing. Most of them choose what they become. Geralt turned and walked toward the opening. Behind him, the immense stone door continued its inexorable descent. Its echo rolled through the sanctuary like the closing of an age. The mountain closed with a sound that seemed to echo across centuries. The final stone door settled into place without violence or haste. It was simply finished. Every seam disappeared until the wall looked as though it had never opened at all. Silence followed. Not the silence left behind by death. The silence of something ancient returning to sleep. Geralt stood in the narrow passage beyond the sanctuary, breathing heavily. Blood still soaked the bandage across his shoulder, and every muscle protested with each step. He had survived battles against Strigas, higher vampires, wild hunts, and now an empire that stretched across the stars. Yet he had never felt older. Behind him, Commander Rax remained inside the sanctuary, not crushed, not executed, simply imprisoned by the choice he had made. Geralt understood the irony. The Empire had built countless prisons for those who refused to kneel. Now one of its own commanders would spend the rest of his life inside a sanctuary built by people he had tried to destroy. Justice, Geralt reflected, rarely looked the way people expected. The hidden passage curved upward through the mountain before opening onto a narrow overlook. Morning had arrived. The first rays of sunlight spilled across snow-covered peaks, turning them gold. Fresh mountain air filled Geralt's lungs. For the first time in many years, he felt at peace. Not because the galaxy had become safer. It hadn't. The Empire still ruled. The Emperor still sat upon his throne. Darth Vader still hunted those touched by the Force. The war would continue. It always did. But somewhere beneath these mountains, children had been given a future. Sometimes that was enough. Footsteps approached. Mirren. She stopped the moment she saw him. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, without warning, she crossed the distance and wrapped her arms around him. You stubborn fool. Geralt winced. My shoulder. She immediately stepped back. Sorry. It's all right. She looked him over carefully. You look terrible. I've looked worse. I doubt it. He almost argued. Instead, he let her believe she'd won. It was easier. One by one, the children emerged from the concealed passage. Some were smiling. Others cried openly. Sarah ran straight toward him. "You came back." "I said I'd try." "You always say try." Geralt looked down at her. "Because nothing's certain." She thought about that. "I think you're wrong." "Oh, you always come back." Geralt didn't answer. One day, she would learn that no one always came back. But today wasn't the day to teach that lesson. Today belonged to hope. Tamsin was the last to emerge. The old scholar carried only one scroll. The others remained inside the sanctuary. She noticed Geralt looking at it. "I left the archives where they belonged." "You spent 30 years protecting them." "I know. Doesn't that bother you?" She smiled. No. She looked toward the children laughing together on the mountain path. The knowledge was never the treasure. Geralt followed her gaze. They were. Tamsin nodded. Exactly. Weeks passed. The Empire searched. Scout ships crossed the mountain range. Probe droids mapped every valley. Imperial survey teams climbed peaks that had not been visited in generations. They found nothing. The sanctuary no longer appeared on scanners. The entrance had become another stretch of ordinary stone. Even those standing a few meters away would never know an ancient refuge rested beneath their feet. Rumors spread through Imperial ranks. Some claimed an entire battalion had vanished. Others whispered about a haunted mountain that swallowed soldiers whole. Eventually, the Emperor redirected his attention elsewhere. There were always new rebellions to crush, new enemies to hunt, new worlds to conquer. The file concerning Geralt of Rivia was never closed. It was simply left unfinished. The children remained hidden, not as prisoners, as students. There were no Jedi Masters waiting for them, no temples, no councils. Instead, they learned from one another. Older children taught younger ones. Mirren taught courage. Tamsin taught history. The sanctuary itself taught patience. Whenever someone sought power for selfish reasons, the ancient halls grew silent. Whenever they acted with kindness or compassion, the mountain answered. Sometimes with light, sometimes with music carried through crystal caverns, sometimes with nothing more than a feeling that they were exactly where they belonged. It was enough. As for Geralt, he stayed longer than he intended. He repaired fences, hunted dangerous predators that wandered too close to the sanctuary, taught the older children how to track animals without disturbing the forest, how to notice broken branches, how to read the wind, how to survive without becoming cruel. One afternoon, Cale asked the question everyone else had been wondering. "When will you leave?" Geralt looked toward the distant horizon. "I don't know. You always leave." "I usually do." "Why?" Geralt was quiet for a long moment. "Because that's the path." The boy frowned. "What if the path ends here?" Geralt smiled faintly. "It never ends. It just changes." Spring came. Snow melted from the mountain slopes. Wildflowers bloomed where battle had once scarred the earth. The graves near the canyon disappeared beneath green grass. Life continued, as it always had. On the morning Geralt finally departed, no speeches were given, no ceremonies. He preferred it that way. Mirren handed him a freshly sharpened silver sword. "You neglected this." "I noticed." "You were distracted." "A little." She hesitated before speaking again. "If you ever need us." Geralt shook his head. "No." She frowned. "No. You'll have enough to protect." She understood. He wasn't saying goodbye because he didn't care. He was saying goodbye because he did. The children gathered around him one last time. Sarah hugged him tightly. "Will we see you again?" Geralt looked toward the endless road stretching beyond the mountains. Then back at the children. Maybe. It wasn't the answer they wanted. It was the only honest one he had. Geralt descended the mountain alone. The wind tugged gently at his cloak. Somewhere below waited another village, another rumor, another monster, perhaps another destiny he never asked for. He no longer questioned why he had been brought to this galaxy. Some questions didn't need answers, only acceptance. Behind him, hidden beyond sight and memory, the sanctuary endured. Children laughed beneath ancient trees. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Hope survived. The empire would one day fall. Another generation would rise. Stories would become legends. Legends would become myths. And somewhere among them would be the tale of a white-haired wanderer from another world who carried no lightsaber, sought no glory, and asked for no reward. He simply stood between innocent people and the darkness. Sometimes, that was enough to change the galaxy. Geralt adjusted the twin swords across his back and continued down the winding trail without looking behind him. The path stretched onward, disappearing into the morning light. As it always would, may the Force be with you. More stories await.